I worked as an infrastructure manager in the corporate office of a minor retail chain about 14 years ago. The conditions were kinda sucky, and the IT staff were mostly a good group of funny dudes and dudettes who tried to make the most of it and got along pretty great, honestly. The software development lead was this pale, pudgy, mid to late 30s guy named Philip. Philip had an untreated condition, which caused him to compulsively lie constantly and without any hesitation. Not just little lies either, big, giant ones, completely straight-faced. No matter what the topic was too, he would always add in. Sometimes we would bring up subjects just to see what he would say. It didn't matter if it was one-on-one or in a call with 4 bros, he'd do it all the same, all the time. Since a common drinking thing with friends is asking me to list Philip's lies around the fire, I'll just rattle some out for context. Something about a mouse getting into his cupboards, which he taught to talk by using M&Ms as positive reinforcement. How we got his high school marching band signed to a record contract, my all-time favorite personally. How he could kick 90-yard field goals, but NFL teams passed on him because he had 3 heart attacks. How he was the sole survivor of 2 plane crashes. He once stole a fire truck to put out his neighbor's bonfire because smoke was getting in his house. And when he took it back, he parallel parked it so good they were so impressed that they offered him a job. You get the point. It was really weird. It was also stuff like, sorry, I'm late getting back from lunch. Some guy tried to rob the grocery store, so I jumped across the register and choked him out. They wanted me to stay and talk to the police, but I was worried he would press charges when he finally woke up. I know this probably doesn't have the impact it should, but it's hard to explain how odd it is to have like a 40-year-old dude in a shirt and tie tell you that when he test drives a car, he takes it to his place so he can do backflips in it. He only buys cars that survive the backflip, and that's how he ended up in the Hyundai Sonata you're sitting in. It just sucks the air out of the room, like when someone is yelling on the subway or something. Once, one of the owners called me and said, none of you guys were around, so they sent that Philip guy to help me. Never let that guy get anywhere near our fucking suite again. He's fucked up, dude. No idea what happened, but I heard it had something to do with Babylon 5. Anyway, the other guys would sort of egg him on at times. I didn't really, though. I kind of felt bad, because I would think about if he knew he was doing it when he was doing it, how would that make him feel? Like, you're doing it again, Philip, you know? Perhaps knowing he might not get away with it this time, but that he couldn't help it. Or it was one more thing to keep track of in his never-ending lexicon of lies. What I was pretty firm about, though, was that no one was going to call him out on it. Mostly because I had no idea what he would do, but also because I really didn't want to work in an environment where every day was some bullshit argument. And it wouldn't really be fair to him either. It's not like he could help it. I made sure every new hire knew these rules. I had been there for almost 3 years, and never had any sort of untoward interactions to him or about him. If anything, perhaps I was a bit overly empathetic of what it must feel like. All we truly knew about him was that he lived in a mobile home on his family's property, which had a giant fountain from a Vegas casino in it, because he knew a guy who dismantled one and smuggled it to him. He had married his wife when he was 31 and she was 16, which required parental consent in our state. Big, weird, eventful jump forward. One day, Philip was sitting in the developer suite when out of nowhere he suddenly said this. Hey, Ricky, come check this out. He had a picture of himself with guns and tactical gear. I asked for the Cho special. Tomorrow, me, is dead. He's been trying to steal my power, you know, so you might want to call in sick. Ricky, thankfully, with everything he had in his body, just said, cool, man. Then he got up, promptly went to legal, and immediately reported it. Philip got let out in handcuffs and termed. He obviously wasn't held too long for threats. The police told me to keep my doors locked and my curtains closed until it all blew over. I cleaned the garage out so we could park in it and limit the time exposed outside. It was a tense few months for my then-girlfriend and I. It was well known that I used to have to go into work super early to cover for my engineers on Fridays before anyone else was there. Just me and this big empty parking lot. I remember thinking on every drive over that it was likely my last day on Earth. How I just hoped I didn't hear anything first before it happened. When I closed on my first house, I teared up a little bit. Perhaps I was being sentimental, but I was thinking about how Philip finally wouldn't know where to find me. It kind of fucked Ricky up though, and he quit soon after. I once asked him what made him report it in spite of the normal stream of whatever we were used to. He just said, the motherfucker was talking about power like he was Skeletor or some shit. Ricky is on my Facebook feed constantly with opposing political views to me, but I've never put him on snooze once. I'm very thankful for what he has to say. As a weird follow-up, I met the guy's cousin a few years later. The dude told me that Philip and his wife had a really weird relationship, like she would buy Philip nothing but toys for Christmas. Not action figures or Funko, but like airplanes and dinosaurs and fire trucks. He would just sit on the floor playing with them, making child noises. It wasn't like a weird sexual thing either. I guess just another big red flag flapping in the breeze. I've never shared this story, except strangely enough to my teacher at the time. I was in the first grade at Northside Elementary in DeSoto, Texas. We lived about 3 long blocks down, as my mother liked to call it. I personally feel like it was a lot more. My sister and I were brought to school on a regular basis and walked home together. My parents decided to divorce right around this time. My dad moved out and we started seeing him every other weekend. My mom began dating someone else, and I remember she no longer became interested in talking to us about school and such. Instead, she became very preoccupied with her new relationship. I remember she often had me walking to school as well as coming home. Thinking back, I'm not sure why I was late this day. Might have been a doctor's appointment or something. I just remember that it wasn't very late at all. Maybe just about an hour or so after school started. My mom pulled up to the school in the car and I got out. I remember hoping she would wait there to watch me go up the flights of stairs and inside, but she drove off immediately, much to my dismay. And this is when I saw him. A man, pretty normal looking, stepped out of a car looking directly at me. My mom had just pulled off, and this man was the only person around. He crossed the street quite quickly, at an angle coming directly towards me. I remember turning and running up the steps. There were 3 flights of stairs with landings in between. When you're a little girl though, those stairs seem much bigger. I remember looking over my shoulder as he literally began running up the stairs after me. I had that horrible gut reaction and ran as fast as I could. I remember the double doors in front of me. I was panicked, thinking I would not make it. Even at that young age, I felt the energy coming from this otherwise normal-looking person who looked like a dad. I remember the huge intrinsic feeling of doom and urgency to go through those doors. I did. I immediately turned around and saw him, standing on part of the second set of stairs. He just stood there, staring at me, as I looked at him from inside the building. He gave a frustrated look, then turned and walked away back to his car. I remember telling my teacher about it. Maybe a week later, a police detective showed up to interview me about what happened. This makes me think it may be connected to something that happened in that area at that time. I don't think I've ever been that afraid in my entire life, and it was a powerful internal fear. It was like my body told me to immediately run. I'm from a small town, the kind where you're in the same class with the same kids from preschool through graduation. I was never popular and had my fair share of bullies, but never as bad as one particular kid in my class, Max. He was on the shorter side and had these little round glasses with his hair slicked to the side like he was right out of a movie cast as the stereotypical nerd. He kept to himself and didn't really interact with others much if he could avoid it. Fast forward to 8th grade. We were paired as lab partners and had to sit at the same table together every day for the entire year. I considered myself a fairly nice person and always went out of my way to make sure I was not rude to people, especially people who hadn't really done anything to deserve it. So, of course, I was friendly and happy to be his partner, as long as he did his fair share of the work. The year came and went, and he was shy but very polite. We got along fine being partners. 9th grade started, and I had a lot of troubles at home with my birth father. I chose to move in with my mother a few towns over. I was only about 30 minutes away, but I had to start a completely new school a month into my freshman year, and honestly, it was scary. I may not have been popular at my last school, but I did have several friends at least who I loved and missed dearly. My mom would often drive me to the other town to see my friends and hang out, but I also started making new friends at my new school. It was a good setup, and I continued this way until I was 16 and could drive by myself. I never heard anything from Max in all that time, and honestly, I had kind of forgotten all about him. That was until my junior year of high school. I started casually seeing this other guy, Jack, from my hometown. He asked me to go with him to prom. I was excited and very happy to say yes, as I would get to spend the night with him and my friends from childhood. A couple of months before prom, my mother told me there was this new lady at her job, and she was asking about me because her grandson was seeing me. She wanted a picture so that she could put a face to my name. Well, my mother knew Jack and knew this wasn't his grandmother, so she asked his name, and wouldn't you know it, it was Max. My mother showed her a picture of me that she had on her desk, and the lady went on her way. A few weeks later, she asked the color of my prom dress, so she knew what to get Max so that we matched. My mother was very confused and told her it was pink. About 2 weeks before prom, some of my friends from my hometown told me that Max had been telling some people that we were going to the dance together, and he was so excited. I thought this was very creepy, but I didn't put too much thought into it. Night of the prom, I picked Jack up, and we headed over to the school, only to find Max and his grandmother waiting outside the entrance so she could take pictures of us before we went in. I always had a hard time disappointing people, so I politely took a couple of token pictures with him as my actual date stood off to the side and waited for me to be finished. If Max's grandmother was at all confused that I had brought another date, she never showed it. The rest of the night actually went smoothly though, and Jack and I had a really good time. We didn't see Max anywhere, so we assumed he had just left. Other than his grandmother telling my mom after that he had lost my number and trying to get it for him, which thankfully my mother did not give him, I didn't hear too much from him until we graduated. I went to a state college. I had heard that he had gotten into a well-respected private university. Everything was fine for the first few weeks of college. Then I suddenly ran into him. He caught me on the way to class one day. I was polite and asked him if he was a student here too, which I found out he was. I chatted with him for a minute before hurrying off to my own class. It was a relatively harmless interaction, but it creeped me out quite a lot, since I knew he got into that other school. I wondered why exactly he would choose to go to this inferior state college. For the next few months, I would run into him almost daily. He always wanted to talk and never seemed to interact with anybody else. I found out from some girls in my dorm that he had been hanging around asking about me too, and trying to figure out my class schedule, where I would be and when. He also told them that he was my boyfriend, and he passed up a scholarship to go to another college to come here and be with me instead. They figured out he was lying, thankfully, when they never saw us together for long periods, or him up in the rooms with me, and stopped answering his questions. I left at the end of the semester to move home and take classes at a nearby school. Obviously, I did not tell him I was going. The following year, I got married to my boyfriend from senior year of high school. Dumb, I know. Anyway, we were in his small town, which is the same community as my hometown, for a fair shortly after our wedding. While walking around and enjoying ourselves, I could see Max staring at us from the end of the block. It was the first time I had been genuinely fearful of him, as the look on his face was nothing short of hatred. I tried to ignore him and go about my night, seeing him a few more times, always with that hateful look on his face. Thankfully, though, nothing else happened. The next few years passed by quickly, with me hearing nothing from him at all. I didn't even know if he still lived in the area or not, to be honest. I found out a little while after that he did, when I started working at a clothing store in town. He would stop in and sit in that dad chair next to the door for all the guys to hang out while their people shopped. I mentioned it to my manager because of our history, and the fact that he would stare at me constantly while sitting there, but he always came in with this girl. I later found out that it was his sister, so they didn't think too much of it. He never spoke to me though, he always just stared. When I was well into my mid-20s, I moved to a city in my home state, but still several hours away from my small town. I'm 30 now and doing quite well in life, other than a random Facebook friend request, which I rejected. I haven't heard from him since, and I hope it stays that way. This was back in 2013, when I was living in New York City as a 23-year-old. I was living with my best friend from college, on the west side near Times Square in K-Town. I was going through some tough times back then, as I was unemployed at that time. I had a lot of time though, so I would go on walks by myself to clear my head from time to time. One night, while I was feeling especially depressed, I decided to walk to K-Town to grab myself a drink. I'm Korean, by the way. I walked into this Korean bar and got some weird looks from the waiter as I asked for a table by myself. After ordering a couple of soju bottles, I was feeling pretty drunk, so I decided to walk back home. As I was exiting the bar, however, this Korean guy followed me. He looked very normal, just like your standard, nice Korean guy. He told me he'd seen me drinking at the bar by myself, and that he would love to walk me home to make sure I got there safe. I politely declined. After all, my apartment was pretty close by. He insisted, though, and he looked really harmless, so I decided it couldn't hurt to take him up on his offer. We walked about 10 minutes together, I think, and it was actually quite pleasant. We were both a little bit drunk, but I remember talking about all sorts of things, nothing really too personal. When we finally arrived at my apartment, I thanked him and wished him farewell. Now, my apartment was a 5-story walk up, and there was a main door where we needed a key to open and get into the building, since there was no doorman. I didn't think much of it. I inserted my key to open the door and went in. The door takes a while to close shut though, and it was my mistake for not checking before I went up the stairs. While I was approaching the second floor, I heard someone grab the door from closing. I heard footsteps coming up the stairs rapidly. I suddenly got goosebumps all over my body, and I felt like I was in danger. As I started to pick up my pace, I heard the footsteps begin going faster and faster up the stairs. I lived on the 5th floor, so I started to run up, clutching my keys in my hand. The guy started to run up the stairs as well, and I could hear him getting closer and closer to me. This all happened over just a couple of seconds, but it felt like forever. I finally got to my floor, and as I tried to open the door, I looked back and saw the man's head appear over the staircase. I rushed to open the door and managed to close it right in his face. My heart was beating so fast I didn't know what to do at that point. It was already 3 a.m. and my roommate was fast asleep. Luckily, he didn't knock or anything, so I decided to just go to my room and hope that he would go home. At around 7 a.m. though, my roommate suddenly woke me up. She told me there was a man standing in front of our apartment door. My heart sank, and I explained the whole situation to her. She and I went to the door and screamed we were going to call the police if he didn't go home. I looked through the peephole, and he told me he would only go home if I gave him my number. We then called the police and saw him being escorted out. My roommate had to go to work, so she left the apartment and called me a few minutes later. She told me she saw the guy speaking to the police downstairs. Apparently, he tried to lie to the officers that I was his girlfriend, and we'd gotten into a fight. My roommate went up to them and explained to the officers that I do not have a boyfriend, and that she didn't know him at all either. The police let him off with a warning. About 2 hours later, I heard a buzz from the main door downstairs. Maybe it was the police following up. Surely it could not be him again. I answered the intercom, and I was shook. It was him again. "Just give me your number, please, and I'll go away," he said. I warned him that I was going to call the police again if he didn't leave. A couple of minutes later, I began to hear ferocious knocking on my door. He must have somehow gotten in when someone was entering the building. I was so scared at that point, I immediately called the police. Unfortunately, this time the guy ran away before they got there. The worst part about this experience was me and my roommate being so scared to leave and come back to our apartment. I would have anxiety every time I came home, worried I might see him waiting in front of our apartment door. For about a week, the police escorted us when we felt scared. Bless them. I never saw him again, but it was one of the scariest moments of my life. So, I take my dad's ashes up to Glacier National Park every year. I lived in Colorado when this story happened, and I was headed down south through Idaho after I had just visited Montana. My car broke down in Salmon, Idaho, and a nice man helped me out. I was headed through the mountains to Boise to visit a friend. It was about a 5-hour drive before I entered the truly mountainous section of Idaho. I saw a hot spring on the side of this 2-lane highway along the Salmon River. I decided to take a quick dip after the stress of having my car breaking down. The hot spring had a bathhouse up at the top near the road, and a wheelchair ramp that went down to the area near the springs, where they were sat on the side of the river. People had created little bath-shaped sections in the river that were separated by river stones. Actually, you could sit in a spot that was shaped like a hot tub, so it held the water from the hot springs while the river rushed over it. I got out of my car and headed down to the hot spring. I took my dog with me as well. It was twilight. About every half an hour a car passed by. Knowing that I was alone, essentially, I took off my top. I was sitting in the hot spring and actually took a photo of a car approaching. The car pulled up right next to mine, in front of the bathhouse. It was a truck with 3 men in it. Seamlessly, one man got out of the driver's side and 2 men hopped out of the passenger side. They moved without qualms and were covered in heavy black gear. They looked to be hunters. I couldn't see the expressions on their faces though. The driver headed down the wheelchair ramp towards me, not hesitating. He took big, long strides. I recognized that there was a danger. The 2 passengers from the other side of the car headed down the steep bank along the wheelchair ramp, taking a shortcut. I was stuck between both parties. Hastening, I hid and dressed myself underwater, while my dog growled. He almost never growls. I've only heard him do so all of twice in my entire life, and this was the 2nd time. The driver began swiftly walking towards me. He walked out onto the rocks into the river, continuously following towards me, even though he was covered in heavy gear that could get him waterlogged if he fell in. The other 2 passengers from the side of the car were also walking out on the rocks directly in front of me. The driver got so close that I had to grab my dog before he lashed out at the driver. I was freaking out. I grabbed my phone, my keys, and my clothes. I dragged my dog in between the 2 parties, my heart in my ears. The driver did not stop though. He quickly turned around, making an arc and changing his direction to come for me still. He was taking these big, confident strides. The passengers were walking towards me as well. I was trapped in between them. I ran up the bank, dragging my dog pretty much by his collar all the way into my car. The only way that I could get into my car without them grabbing me was by throwing my dog into the back and lunging myself into the passenger side door of my car. I threw my keys into the ignition and turned them right when the men were walking up between my car and theirs. I managed to hit the lock button on the door right as they walked up. Before anything else happened, or before I saw their faces, I ended up throwing myself into the driver's seat, reversing my car, and hightailing it out of there. I drove about 20 minutes down the road. I crossed the river on a bridge and hid my car behind a bank near some campers. It was well hidden from the main road. The campers were staring at me, of course, wondering just what was going on. I sat there and waited, though. Another 10 minutes passed by, and lo and behold, that same truck drove by. It appeared they were looking for me. I managed to wait another half an hour, and then I drove up far into the mountains, and then over to Boise, and finally, into safety. I'm currently 21 and female, and this happened to me about 6 years ago when I was 15 years old. I live in a relatively small town where everyone knows everyone else. For reference, there were about 120 kids in my graduating class in high school. The town is actually so small that there's not a lot of ground to cover, so it wasn't unusual for parents to let their teenagers wander around outside with their friends. My friend from a different town had come over to my house because we were going to see my school's musical later that night. We decided to go wander around outside until it was finally time to go. Since she was from a different town, she was very unfamiliar with the area. I suggested we go down to my local train tracks because there was this cool cliff overpass type thing where you could just sit and relax and watch the river. I had been to the train tracks with my friends many times before, and people my age used to hang out there all the time. This was sometime in early March, so it was still quite cold where I lived. Even though it was chilly though, I remember distinctly that I wore flip-flops for some reason. This will be important later. The train tracks intersected a street in my town which was quite close to my house. So this is where we entered the tracks. We were walking along and spotted a middle-aged man who appeared to be alone and on the phone. We thought nothing of it and kept on walking. We made it to the overpass and were sitting there just hanging out when we noticed the man we'd passed earlier was slowly inching closer and closer. We both took note of this, but decided not to panic, since it was possible he was just slowly trying to make his way down the tracks. Maybe 5 minutes had passed, though, and the man was getting increasingly closer and closer to us. At this point, we noticed he was getting closer at an alarming rate as well. He was not continuously in motion. It was more like we'd notice him standing still doing whatever, and then a minute later, once we looked away, he was standing still even closer to us than he was prior. Now he was close enough where we could clearly make him out. He was within earshot and could easily get us if that was his goal. My friend and I were starting to get very nervous. We're two teenage girls in the middle of essentially the woods, with no one around us other than this creepy man. Now, I've watched a lot of investigation Discovery in my day, so I think it's best to just try to promptly make my way out of there without creating chaos. I decided it would be a good idea to pull out my phone and pretend to talk to my mother as we began walking back to the main road. My friend and I were calmly walking down the tracks while I held the phone up to my ear. I was saying things like, "Yeah, we're at the tracks, we're on our way home now." Just making shit up so this guy thought my mom was aware of my exact location. There was a point where we had to walk directly past the man, though, in order to make it to our destination. It was at this point when he opened his mouth clear as day and said this. "You know, I know you're not on your phone." At this point, my fight or flight kicked in, and I was terrified. Up until this moment, the creepy man had not directly said or done anything to make us think he was a direct threat. The situation was uncomfortable enough that my friend and I thought we better head out. When the man said those words to me, though, I quickly realized that the perceived threat was both real and very dangerous. As soon as my brain registered what he had said, my friend and I both took off running for our lives. I was never one to enjoy physical activity, let alone running, but I swear I could have won an Olympic medal that day. I ran so fast my flip-flop broke in half, and I ended up running barefoot on the gravel that lined the tracks. I was too scared that if I looked back I would see him chasing after me right behind me, so I never did. When I finally began running out of steam, I quickly looked back and saw the man standing still right where we had left him. He didn't run after us, but I couldn't shake the fear of turning around and seeing him chasing me. When we finally made it to the main road, I quickly called my mom and told her what had happened. She was conveniently driving down the exact same road we were on and pulled up about 2 minutes later and took us home. My friend and I had never been so scared in our entire lives. I hadn't been to those train tracks since, and to this day, I still think about that man who knew I wasn't on the phone and what his intentions were that day. This took place when I, 26 and female, was about 16 years old. My aunt was in town visiting, and we were coming back from the grocery store. We were driving back to my mom's house. My parents are divorced, and she lived way out in the country. Like it was a 10-minute drive from anywhere. We pulled up to our driveway and a red car pulled in behind us. My aunt and I stayed in the car, and a man got out and approached our driver's side door. I can't exactly rightly tell you why I thought he looked like a creep, but he definitely did look like one. Very pasty skin, eyes that were staring too hard, just overall weird. He claimed he was lost and looking for his way to a fitness center in the town next over. The exact fitness center that's about a minute away from where the grocery store is, i.e. the opposite direction of where we just came from. Very odd, but I still gave him earnest directions. He thanked me, but continued to stare at me. He asked if we knew each other, and I replied no immediately. He gave me his name, and I again repeated, "No, I do not know you." A couple of seconds of awkward staring, and he asked me what my name was. Well, being an idiot and feeling quite anxious, I told him. That was a mistake. He confirmed we didn't know each other. "Oh, really, you think?" And headed back to his car. We watched him leave. My aunt and I both agreed that he was very strange, but we shook it off and took the groceries inside. From where we had parked, you have to take a little windy path up behind the house to the back door. My aunt goes outside to grab the rest of the groceries, and I settle on the couch in the living room and take a look outside. I see that same red car in the driveway. My aunt rushed upstairs and said the guy was almost to our door and claimed he'd forgotten the directions we'd just given him. My aunt curtly told him once more and demanded he leave. The directions were truly simple when following the main roads. I was freaked, she was freaked, but we never saw him again. A month passes, and I'm chilling at my dad's and posting something like, "I'm bored at my dad's house, who wants to chill?" on Facebook. Guys, I'm telling you, always set your page to private. Several minutes later, I got a message from that very same guy asking if I wanted him to come over. I was home alone and understandably terrified. I immediately blocked him and told my dad, who went to one of his cop friends to see if they knew anything about this guy. Apparently, this man had been kicked out of a local university for stalking and had 2 other counts of stalking on top of that. Multiple restraining orders as well. Yikes. Another month goes by, and I'm in study hall with a friend. He's telling me about this guy who was stalking his older sister. I don't remember the specific details, but it was definitely the story of someone being stalked. The craziest part was this stalker almost drove this girl's brother off the road in an attempt to get him to pull over. Once he did, the stalker jumped out and was making his way to my friend's vehicle when my friend noped out of there. I'm sure you guessed it, but the stalker and the creep I ran into were the very same person. I decided to reach out to my friend whose sister was stalked. He asked if I had heard about last summer. Apparently, the man was arrested for attempting to kidnap 3 different women within an hour, failing on all attempts, and almost running over the last woman's father, who was with her at the time. I confirmed it via news article. I'm still pretty floored by this all. I'm something of an avid cyclist, and have been all my life. It's my preferred method of transportation, in fact. I also live in a town that's famous for its ever-expanding network of pedestrian/bike paths. We've even won some awards for it over the years, in fact. I'm also an Iraq veteran. This may explain something that happens later. The summers where I live tend to be quite humid, but otherwise pleasant. One gorgeous August day off from work, I decided to go for a ride. I didn't have a specific end destination in mind, but I got this great idea to ride along a southbound trail that I don't go through very often. There are enough traffic lights along that section that it should have been a relatively safe ride. It also goes along the border of a rather popular city park. I figured there'd be quite a lot of people there, especially on such a nice day. Well, I was kinda sorta right about that. About 20 minutes or so into my otherwise smooth pleasure ride, I come up to a couple of bends in the path not long before the park. There are a few people jogging or walking their dogs, 1 or 2 people walking by themselves. So far, nothing unusual. The trails are paved and divided into 2 lanes, just like a regular road, where you're supposed to stay in the right-hand lane. Not far ahead, I noticed this dark-haired dude walking in the wrong lane. It's not illegal to do so, but it can be quite dangerous. I noticed immediately that he seemed to have no regard whatsoever for others walking in the proper direction, and almost bumped into a few of them without a thought. I figured maybe he was drunk or something. I also saw, though, that he was wearing what looked like an old navy blue puffy jacket on a humid day in the middle of August. Call it situational awareness or what have you, but no one in their right mind wears a fall jacket in the summertime south of the Mason-Dixon line. I'm about 30 or so feet away from this guy when he finally sees me. My stomach drops. I swear to y'all on my own life, he paused mid-step and his face just melted into this downward-facing Joker smile. Then he opened his jacket, revealing a sweaty gray shirt underneath as he reached inside for something I couldn't see. That's when in my head I went, "Nuh-uh, motherfucker." I don't know what some of you reading this might do if faced with something like this, but I got this batshit insane idea. Instead of turning around, instead of screaming or stopping, I pedaled faster. Without a second thought, I spun the pedals as hard as I could with the intention of charging him like a medieval jouster. Dangerous moments like these may only last a few seconds in reality, but I swear it felt like I was building up speed and barreling towards this guy for a good minute or 2. I don't know why my brain decided that charging him head-on was the thing to do. Maybe it could have just easily gotten me hurt or killed, but I didn't care. I can point out Mosul, Baghdad, Fallujah on an unlabeled map of the Middle East. I was scared, of course, but something I haven't felt since I've been over there drove me to do something. He saw me speeding up and hunkering down, but wasn't trying to get out of the way. Only within seconds, maybe less than 2 feet shy of slamming into him, did he finally realize what was just about to happen. He tried to dive to the left. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I didn't even think about it. I just went and kept going. I later happened to pass a female jogger or 2 coming the opposite direction, and gave them a heads up about the man. They promptly turned around. I sought a different route home that day and locked all my doors when I got home. I haven't been on that stretch of trail since. I didn't actually think to tell the police at the time, given that I wasn't actually harmed and just acting scary isn't necessarily a crime in and of itself, but I probably should have. About a month later, a local news story crossed my Facebook feed. The fifth rotting body in less than 2 years, just discovered near that same area of the trail near a creek. Cops said that they weren't exactly sure how the homeless man had died, but it didn't look like a natural death. All of the victims were known vagabonds, people that nobody would otherwise give a shit about. I'm not saying that I definitely bull-rushed a serial killer here, but to this day, I often ponder about that possibility. "22 years ago, I was 11 years old. Growing up, I was always taught to respect adults, especially when in someone else's home. I was the youngest of 3. My dad traveled pretty frequently on business, and my mom was usually busy working or driving the 2 older siblings to whatever obligations they had going on. This meant that I spent a lot of time in other people's homes. I was always very friendly, polite. I enjoyed speaking to adults, actually. I was also an extremely nervous kid and tried my best to hide it. My mom was very emotionally abusive to me, and I believed her when she blamed my being a horrible child on her own abusive actions. Therefore, I was constantly in fear that someone would find out just how truly awful I really was. My approach to life at just 11 years old was, be polite, never make waves, and don't piss off Mom. It was the week of 4th of July, and a girl I went to school with, Leia, invited me and another girl, Carla, over to swim in her pool and spend the night. At this point, I'd known both girls for about 5 or 6 years, but we had only recently become better friends. My mom dropped me off and gave me the usual, have fun, don't embarrass me speech. I actually remember having so much fun the entire day. I was young for my grade, so while I was still 11, Leia and Carla were both 12. They flirted with boys and even wore bras. I was a tomboy and as flat as the floor, so Leia and Carla were really cool to me. We had the best time together. At night, we did girly things like talk about boys and play with makeup. It was so different from my normal summer night hangouts playing capture the flag with the neighborhood boys. The next morning, we were still giggling and having lots of fun together. Leia asked her mom if Carla and I could spend the night over again. She said yes, and me and Carla jumped around with excitement. It was the 4th of July, and Leia's dad was coming back from wherever he had been the night before, with fireworks. A bit later, Leia's dad, LD, pulled into the driveway. Now, I had never met Leia's dad before. He stepped out of the car wearing cut-off jean shorts and no shirt, smoking a cigarette. His hair was very straggly and greasy. Leia called out, "Hey, Dad." "Who's this?" he replied, looking at me. I introduced myself and he walked inside. Leia's mom told us to pick things up around the house because they were having some people over that night. We did as she asked. I remember almost immediately noticing a shift in the overall vibe in the house, though. It was something I was quite familiar with, as my mom could change the feeling in our house from warm and happy to cold and spiteful in the blink of an eye. Typically, there was some sort of yelling that accompanied that shift in my house, though. It was different at Leia's. It was so cold, but everyone appeared to be going on as usual. A couple of hours later, we went outside with LD. He had this enormous slingshot thing he had made in the garage. He asked me if I wanted to see what it did. Sure. He put a potato in it and launched the thing into a field across the street. He asked if I wanted to try it too. Really? Yeah. I would never be allowed to do this sort of thing at home, so of course I took him up on it. Leia and Carla wanted to try it too. He gave a quick sure and walked away to go grab another beer. Once they were finished, he asked if I'd like him to show me some cool tricks he could do with the slingshot. He addressed me directly by name. He did not ask Leia or Carla. This felt weird, but I smiled and wanted to keep being polite, since he was an adult and I was a guest in his home after all. Eventually, friends of Leia's parents started to trickle in here and there. Leia, Carla, and I went back and forth between playing in the pool and playing in the garage. Every time we'd go back to the garage, LD would ask me lots of questions and comment on how cool I was. He would ask me if I had a boyfriend yet, if I too had started wearing a bra like Leia. Leia just kinda laughed and said something like, "Stop talking about that stuff, jeez." I smiled and tried to hide how uncomfortable it made me feel. A few minutes later, a man arrived with his daughter. This guy was LD's best friend. Leia's dad began calling my name and motioning me to come over. "Hey, this is Leia's friend. She's really cool and she loves our slingshot." The two of them built it together. "Oh yeah? Hi, Leia's friend." "Oh, nice to meet you." As the night continued, it felt like every time Leia, Carla, and I were near LD and Dude, for the future reference, they had something to ask or tell me. The other two didn't seem to think this was weird or even notice, really. It was now dark. The fireworks were all done, and I was getting really tired of having to engage with conversation with LD and Dude. They smelled like cigarettes, and they'd put their arms around my shoulders a couple of times. I didn't like them touching me, but I never said anything. I just acted like everything was fine and tried to laugh it off. I suggested we go back to Leia's room to play this game we had played a few times over the last couple of days. Finally, we were away from them. Then LD and Dude came into Leia's room and said we should come outside to the bonfire for some s'mores. They also had another brilliant idea for us. We should sleep in the camper tonight. Leia's family had this camper at the very end of the backyard, right next to the bonfire. Leia and Carla both loved this idea, but it just made me sick. Still, I didn't want to spoil any fun, and I didn't want to offend LD or Dude. They were both adults, and this was LD's house, so I kinda had to be nice. All I wanted to do was run away from both of them, though. We were walking out to the backyard carrying blankets and pillows. Dude walked up to us and said his daughter wanted to join us in the camper tonight. His daughter was only a year or so younger than me, about 10, but she was much smaller and acted so much younger. She was very timid and quiet, and when she did speak, it was almost babyish. LD and Dude were getting more drunk by the minute. After we finished getting set up in the camper, DD, the Dude's daughter, asked me to take her back to the house to go to the bathroom. I had just met DD a few hours before, but she seemed to sort of cling to me immediately. When we were walking back to the house, around a half football field from the camper, she suddenly grabbed my hand while we were walking. She asked if she could sleep next to me in the camper. "Sure," I said. On the way back from the bathroom, DD took my hand again and held it tightly the entire way back as she sucked her thumb. She clung to me and asked me once again if I was really going to sleep next to her. This made me even more nervous. I just wanted to run away. We all got situated in the camper, and Leia, Carla, and DD were asleep pretty quickly. LD and Dude were soon joined by another guy whose voice I didn't recognize. All three were right outside the camper, sitting by the bonfire. They were drunk and extremely loud. I could tell something was so wrong about this situation. My heart was racing, and I was praying to God to help me make it through the night. Suddenly, though, they were quiet. I felt the camper moving. The door opened. He whispered into the camper, "Leia's friend. Leia's friend." My back was turned towards him, and I pretended to be asleep. I didn't move, I didn't answer, I just waited. After a few minutes, he went back outside. I heard him say, "She's asleep." Dude told him, "Just wake her up. Tell her we have something to show her or something."
A few minutes later, LD returned and again started whispering my name. He went back outside and told them I wasn't waking up. The third guy told him to just shake me awake. Thankfully, I positioned myself furthest from the door on an upper bunk with DD next to me. Leia and Carla happily took the bottom beds, which blocked any way of reaching me or DD. LD and Dude came around into the camper a few more times after that, but didn't say anything else. They eventually all passed out around the campfire. I thought that night would never end, but eventually it did. When we finally got out of the camper and went back to the house, I called my mom to pick me up. It was like nothing had ever happened. I felt crazy the next day. I was surrounded by all these people, and yet no one had noticed anything strange. I questioned myself and the entire experience for years. What if I was really just being paranoid? What if I had interpreted the whole night completely wrong? Leia and I quickly drifted apart after this. I never went back to her house, and I never told anyone about what happened that night. Over 10 years later, during a visit to my parents, my mom was going on about all the gossip she'd heard recently. I was only half listening when suddenly she mentioned, "Hey, that girl Leia from grade school, do you remember her?" Her dad had been in the local paper a few months earlier. He had been arrested and charged with sexual molestation of a minor. Apparently, there had been a couple other claims years prior to his arrest, but nothing ever came of those. I had no interest in knowing anything more about him, though, or in the outcome. I knew in my heart what he and his friends had in mind that night, but I also worried about offending someone or how it would look if I had asked to leave. I also didn't want Leia to be hurt or embarrassed either, so I pretended to be oblivious to her dad's blatantly disgusting behavior. I still hate it when someone tries to put their arm on top of my shoulder. When I was about 3 or 4, my parents went on vacation out of the country. My siblings and I were left with a family my mom knew through a friend. While my siblings were at school during the day, I stayed back. That dad was just like LD, and I was not able to escape him. Things did not end the way they did in the camper. When I was at Leia's, I knew something was wrong because I felt the same way I had back when I was 3. DD's behavior only confirmed my fears. I wish I would have said something comforting to her in the moment or hugged her to help her feel safe, but I didn't. I didn't say much of anything. I did have her sleep next to me on the top bunk, but that's about it. When I was about 9, I had mentioned what happened to my mom while they were on vacation, but she completely shot me down. Said there was no way that happened. Said I would have tried to fight him off and would never have let anyone touch me. Her response made me believe it had been my fault, and that I let it happen. I also learned that I could not rely on her for support. So the morning she picked me up from Leia's, I knew she wouldn't believe me, or worse, she would have blamed me. I learned later that this was her way of escaping responsibility. If she were forced to acknowledge what had happened, that would mean admitting she made a horrible mistake in her parenting choices. Although this happened back in December 2019, I still think about it on a nearly daily basis because it was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. I hope it offers some sort of enlightenment on what to do or what not to do if you ever find yourself in a similar situation. Back in early December, I had ventured out to do a bit of late-night shopping. I'm a 31-year-old stay-at-home mother of 2 young children, so once my husband gets home from work, I like to take some time to myself and go shopping, take a drive, or run errands all kid-free. It was around 8:30 p.m. when I arrived at the Target I usually frequent. Now, I'm by no means a paranoid or anxious individual, but I have attended several seminars in college on human trafficking and have done plenty of research on my own, learning to identify red flags and what precautions to take when out in public alone, especially at night. I carry several self-defense items on my person at all times. Capiton, alarm, universal handcuff key, all just in case. I parked directly in front of the store, right next to a cart caddy, and took a mental note of the vehicles parked nearby. Again, just as a precaution. I had that teaching at an early age to always be observant of your surroundings, and I guess being a control freak just kind of naturally makes you that way as well. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary that night though, and the parking lot was actually quite empty, most likely because it was still a weekday. As I entered the store, I began to browse like usual, following the natural flow of the store departments, following the main aisle around. I had been browsing for only 10 to 15 minutes when I noticed a young gentleman in his mid-20s. He was skinny, tall, dressed in a dirty gray two-piece sweatsuit and brown work boots. He looked over to me. I smiled and said hello, but his facial expression remained weirdly blank. He looked like he may have been high on something just by the look in his eyes, but he didn't seem to care for my gesture and quickly moved on. At first glance, there was nothing in particular that alarmed me about him, except I took notice at the fact that he was just wandering down the main aisle with no cart or basket, hands in his pockets, and didn't seem to be with anyone or looking for anything in particular. I continued shopping with no second thoughts though, and made my way over to the next department. Several minutes had passed by then, and that's when I noticed a second young gentleman wearing the same gray sweatsuit, a similar pair of work boots, and again, no cart or basket. He too glanced at me, but he quickly darted his eyes away when he realized I was looking directly at him. Now I became a bit more alerted, but still remained composed and continued browsing. Another 15 minutes or so passed, and that's when a third, older man caught my attention. You guessed it, same gray sweatsuit, same work boots, no cart, no basket, just hands in his pockets. I assumed they were in some sort of work uniform, maybe construction workers or something. But if so, why weren't they walking around together? And why wouldn't they have any items to purchase either? At this point, it was difficult to focus on browsing. I had a bad feeling about these three men, and it became quickly clear that something was a bit off. Over the next 20 minutes or so, I felt as if I was being constantly monitored by the three of them, as if they were all communicating my whereabouts as I continued to make my way through the store. Each department I entered, it didn't take long for me to notice one of the three men pass by whatever aisle I happened to be in, making their presence known to me. I stayed completely vigilant while trying not to panic or allow my suspicions to overwhelm me. Something about their presence felt very heavy and dark, so I decided to test their intentions, prove I wasn't overthinking the situation, and that my bad gut feeling was valid. At this point, I began picking random aisles, traveling back and forth between departments in a very unorganized and random fashion, to see if the men would continue to pass by me as frequently as they had been. Wouldn't you know it, every aisle I popped into, just a few minutes later, one of them would make an appearance, staring me down as they passed by. It felt as if I was being surrounded like a wild animal, hunted even. At this point, they were no longer even trying to be inconspicuous, which was the scariest part of all. Everything instinctual was screaming at me to get out of there. I gripped my cart tightly, and figured if they got too close, I could at least use it to push them away or create some distance between us. By this point, I had been shopping for almost an hour altogether, maybe a bit over, and was ready to purchase the items I needed. But honestly, I felt too uncomfortable to even continue browsing if I wanted to. The men had been following me the entire time, and I was becoming more annoyed if anything. The store was also pretty empty around this time, one of the main reasons I like to go shopping at night, but that made this particular situation even more unsettling. I noticed two preteen girls were wandering around by themselves, which quickly caught my attention because the men had bypassed them as well, making similar advances, only the girls were a bit more oblivious. I quietly got their attention and asked them to go find their parents and stay with them, trying my best not to freak them out. The mother in me was in full-on protection mode. I couldn't even imagine having my young children with me on this night. Thank God they were home safe and sound. As I made my way to the checkout, I noticed one of the men coming up from behind me, walking at a quicker pace this time. I immediately stopped and turned to lock eyes with him as he approached. I will never forget the darkness in his eyes. An eerie smirk formed on his face as he nudged my shoulder, continuing to stare me down, walking backwards to hold his sinister gaze as he exited out the store. I had lost sight of the other two men, and I hated the uncertainty of that. He had made his message very clear in that moment. My stomach dropped and my entire body began to shake. It was a feeling I hadn't felt since I was a kid getting lost in the supermarket. That feeling of desperation. I quickly walked to the checkout and discreetly asked the cashier if I could speak to a manager. I told them what had transpired of the last hour, politely asking for a male employee to walk me to my car and for them to alert their security team member. Well, when I told the manager what had happened, her face immediately sunk as if she had already known about these men. Once I had described them, she confirmed she knew exactly who I was talking about. She expressed that several of the female employees had found the men unsettling in the past, and reassured me that someone would escort me to my car. She made a report about the incident and said she would alert the authorities as well. I was still shaking but felt relieved that she believed me and showed concern for the other young female patrons in the store. She took my information. Then a young male employee walked me out to my car. What I saw as I exited that store made me so sick to my stomach, solidifying all of my suspicions. I noticed that now a white windowless van was parked in the lot directly behind my car, about 3 parking spaces of distance between us. One of the men seated in the driver's seat, and the other 2 leaning against the side of the van facing my car, attempting to hide out of view. I mean, how cliché and obvious can you be? At that point, your license plate might as well read Lady Snatchers. Whatever their intent though, it did not seem pure. I pointed them out to the male employee and yelled out, "There they are!" This prompted the men to scurry into the van and speed out of the parking lot without hesitation. I truly don't know what would have happened if I walked out to my car alone, but I'm freaking grateful I made it home safe and sound and lived to tell my story. Over the following week, I heard there had been several abduction attempts in the shopping center parallel to that target. I'm almost certain it was those same individuals. I grew up in a rural part of northern England, but moved to London 6 years ago to live with my partner, as she had just gotten a job there. I couldn't drive at the time, so I would take the bus to and from work and walk a short way back to our flat. The walk from the bus stop to home never took longer than 10 minutes or so, and it was through a well-lit area as well, lined with shops and various restaurants. Up until this incident, I had never really had any issues on that route. It was November, so it was pretty much dark by the time I left work at 6 p.m. One Friday night, after I had only been living in London a couple of months, one of my work colleagues asked if I wanted to go for a drink with her after work. Now, I'm not a big drinker, but it was a Friday night. My partner was working late anyway, and since I was fairly new in town and desperate to make friends, I agreed to go along for a couple. I took the bus with her straight from work to a pub close to her home. She lived basically the next suburb over from me anyway, so it was fairly close. Not an area I was particularly familiar with, though. I had 2 or 3 drinks, so I was a little bit tipsy, but not drunk. Not that that should matter anyway. I decided to leave at around 10 p.m., so as to not be traveling home too late at night, particularly along a route I did not know. I said my goodbyes and left my colleague and her friends at the pub. On my way out, I stopped to put an empty glass down on the bar. As I did so, I looked down the bar and made brief eye contact with a man sitting a little bit further down. I gave a passing smile, as you might do when you make accidental eye contact with a stranger, then continued on my way out of the pub. The bus stop was maybe 200 yards down and across the street from this pub. You could see it from the entrance. I was about halfway to the stop when I got that prickling feeling on the back of my neck. You know, like how you get when someone's staring at you through a window or perhaps across a busy street. I turned around to look behind me quickly, and it didn't take me long to figure out what was giving me that feeling. It was the man I had glimpsed back at the pub, walking about 20 paces behind me, watching me carefully. I was a little bit weirded out, but I reasoned with myself that it was a Friday night in London, and there were plenty of people on the street. People heading home, people on nights out, people just milling around. I put it down as perfectly innocent, and kept on walking, trying hard not to look back. I reached the stop, and fortunately the bus was only a few minutes away. The man reached the stop only moments later, and proceeded to hover a few feet away from me. I was on my phone and trying not to look at him, but I could just feel his eyes boring into me. I looked up and caught him staring at me, expecting him to look away awkwardly as soon as he realized he had been caught looking. But he didn't. He just kept on staring. This was also the first time I had really gotten a proper look at him. He was a young man, couldn't have been much older than myself actually, and I was in my early 20s at the time. He was quite slender and tall, with short shaved hair. He actually would have been quite good looking, if not for the intensity of his staring. I must have been looking at him for longer than I thought, because he gave me this sly wink, and I quickly looked away. It wasn't the nice kind of wink that might be considered cute or endearing either. It was like those unsmiling, almost threatening kind of winks, the kind that told me he was watching me, that he knew I knew this, and that he did not care one bit. The bus eventually rolled up, and I hopped on, quietly hoping he was not getting on the same bus as me. I wasn't so much afraid at this point as just uneasy. It isn't nice being intensely stared at by anyone, much less a complete stranger. I was still under the assumption at this point, though, that it was just some creepy dude who happened to be at the same bus stop as me. Nothing more than that. I sat down on the lower deck, close behind the driver. My heart sank a little to see the man get on just behind me. Fortunately, there was already someone sat in the seat next to mine, though, so he had to sit across the aisle. Still, he stared at me, now with a strange little smirk on his lips that made me feel even more uncomfortable. I did my best to pretend that I simply hadn't noticed him, only allowing myself an occasional glance up at him to see if he was still watching me. From what I could tell, though, he never looked away once. With each passing minute, I was becoming more and more afraid, despite my best efforts to convince myself that this was all just an innocent misunderstanding on my part. At every stop, I was praying for him to get off, for this to be his stop so I could relax and prove to myself I was just being paranoid. As the stops passed by, I knew I was going to have to get off the bus soon, and I was fairly sure at this point that he was going to follow me. We were coming close to my usual stop when the bus took an unexpected turn onto a housing estate. I was so distracted by this guy staring at me and potentially following me. I had completely forgotten that this was a different bus route to my usual one. In a normal situation, this would not have bothered me, but in my current situation, it was the absolute worst possible thing that could have happened. I was no longer on that well-lit street full of shops in an area I knew so well. Now I was on a dark, quiet, and completely unfamiliar estate. No people around at all, just rows of silent houses with the lights all off. I then realized that I didn't actually know the route home from here either. I knew I had to be close, but having only lived in the area for a couple of months, I hadn't had the chance to come to grips with all the shortcuts yet. I waited until the very last minute to ring the bell for the next stop, and I jumped off very quickly. It was a long shot, but I hoped the weird guy would be caught off guard and not get the chance to follow me. Suffice to say, that plan did not work. In hindsight, I should have just stayed on the bus until it reached the terminal, and then maybe reported my concern to the driver. But at the time, I was a bit tipsy and scared, and I just wanted to go home. It was a dumb, spur-of-the-moment decision, made completely out of panic. He hopped very casually off the bus after me. At this point, there was no doubt in my mind he was following me. I decided to stay at the stop and call someone, anyone to come help me. But all my friends and family that I would usually call in a bad situation lived back home, hundreds of miles away. My partner was working nights and wasn't even allowed to have her phone on her in person. I tried calling the girl who I had been out to the pub with to see if I could maybe double back to hers and stay at her house for the night, but she wasn't answering her phone either. I could call the police, I guess, but what if he realized I had just done that and attacked me before they could get there? All the time I was trying desperately to get in touch with someone who might be able to help me in my current predicament. This guy was casually leaning against the bus stop, hands in pockets, just watching me. Several minutes passed by, and I still had no better plan in mind than to just stay where I was. I certainly didn't want this guy knowing where I lived, after all. These thoughts were all rushing through my mind at about 100 miles per hour, and I damn near crapped myself when suddenly he said, "Hey, what's your name?" I could do nothing but stare at him in surprise for a second or two. Then I forced myself to reply. "Amy," I lied. I figured I didn't want to piss him off at all, so I just answered with whatever name came to my head first. That horrible little smirk slid across his lips again. He was still leaning casually. "Give me your number, Amy. Let's be friends." That didn't sound like a request. There was a sharpness to his voice that made me shudder. "No, thank you," I replied. His face dropped and the smirk disappeared. "Where do you live? I'll walk you there," he said, a little more assertively this time. "I'm okay. I'm staying at a friend's. He's actually coming to get me right now to take me back to his place." I lied again, desperate to come up with anything that would make him go away. He paused for a while, and I could practically hear the cogs turning as he tried to figure out whether or not I was lying. He watched me silently for a long moment, studying my face with this cold calculation. He must have decided that I was lying to him, because he suddenly took a step towards me, and through slightly gritted teeth, as if I was really trying his patience, he repeated, "Give me your number, now." Startled at the sudden move toward me, I took several steps back. He continued to approach me. I panicked and turned and tried to walk away from him, but he reached out and grabbed me hard by the wrist. I spun back around to face him. Now the only look on his face was one of complete anger. "There's no need to be such a bitch about this," he hissed. Fear had surged through me when he grabbed my arm. His touch seemed to burn my skin like an open flame. It was repulsive, so much so that my body almost had a convulsive reaction to being touched by him. I managed to twist my arm out of his grip, and I heard a voice in the back of my mind telling me, "You need to get away now. Run." And I did run. I turned and ran as fast as my legs would carry me, back the way the bus had brought me. I didn't even fully know where I was going, but I knew I had to get myself as far away from this person as possible. I made the mistake of looking over my shoulder once to see him now running after me, only a few feet behind. His eyes were wide and furious. The fear and adrenaline kept me going, longer and faster than I'd ever run before. Just as I reached the end of the road, though, I saw exactly what I needed. I instantly burst into tears of relief. Out of nowhere, 2 police officers were now walking towards me along the other side of the street. I made an immediate beeline for them, now also yelling for help. By the time I reached them, I was sobbing, a breathless mess. I could hardly speak to even tell them what had happened. I managed to sputter a few choice words and turned to point towards my pursuer. By now, he was almost back at the other end of the street. He had simply turned around and walked calmly back toward the bus stop, like he was out for an evening stroll. I was worried that the police officers were just going to think I was some crazy random drunk girl, but they could see I was clearly very shaken, and one of them took off running after the man. The man had, by now, disappeared around the corner at the other end of the street, followed shortly after by the police officer. That was the last I saw of him. The officer who went after the guy radioed his partner a few minutes later to say he had lost them once they reached the main street, but he would keep looking. The officer who had stayed with me took a description of the man from me, and I made a report about what had happened. I told the officer I didn't fully know my way home from where I was, so she walked with me back to my front door. I was shaking the entire way. When I got into my room, I lay in bed crying until I fell asleep. I never heard anything else about it after that. There's no doubt in my mind that if he had caught me that night, he would have harmed me. I believe he was out looking for someone to target. I believe he clocked me the moment we made eye contact in the pub. If given the chance, he would have followed me all the way back to my front door in the hope that I would at some point be alone in a secluded enough area for him to grab me. Everything about his demeanor and the way he spoke to me just screamed that this was a man who was just predatory, and the way he was able to go from being furiously angry enough to chase me down the street to immediately regaining his composure and walking away like nothing happened in order to evade being caught is just absolutely terrifying. I'll remember his face for a long time, and I would not be surprised if it comes up on the news at some point in the future.
This happened when I was a bartender about 4 years ago, but I think about it often, and it has changed the way I operate throughout life. I now refuse to go to any store alone after midnight. For the story's sake, I will tell you ahead of time that I was 25 and an attractive/slender blonde at the time. On a busy Friday night, I was bartending with the bar manager, and he had noticed that we were very low on some bar necessities after the dinner rush. Lemons, limes, bitters, that sort of thing. So I was sent out to go to a 24-hour grocery store down the road to pick up the odds and ends that we would require to get us through the weekend. I picked up everything that was asked of me without much trouble at the store until I got to the liquor aisle. There were two country-looking guys that were probably around my age in the aisle. They were staring at me and whispering to each other in such a way that made me quite uncomfortable. I could only assume that they were making comments about me. All pretty innocent so far, though. Before they could approach me, I grabbed what I needed very quickly and power-walked to the self-checkout. I really booked it out of there, because when you're a bartender, it's kind of like you're on stage and required to be charming and interact with people. The sorts of people you otherwise absolutely wouldn't even be able to tolerate unless you were getting paid to. Thus, why I am not a bartender anymore. Anyway, I get to the self-checkout and hot on my tail are those two guys. I start scanning my stuff in, and they plop down to use the scanning station right next to me. I get a better look at them now that they're so close. One is taller, muscular, quite average looking. The other is shorter and a bit more plump. They both looked dirty though, and their eyes were completely bloodshot. I'm not sure if they were high on something or had already been drinking for a while. They continued to stare at me, and our eyes awkwardly met. I did the pleasant mid-westerny thing to do and flashed them a quick half-assed closed-lipped smile to be polite. The taller one took this as an opportunity to try talking to me. "Hey, looks like you're getting ready for a party, huh?" I replied with something like, "Yeah, something like that, but not for me, though." They walked closer to me and ignored their responsibility to scan their items. "Oh, must be for your boyfriend, huh?" I flashed that awkward, tight-lipped smile once again and rolled my eyes slightly. "This is your hint that I'm not interested, fellas." The taller one continued to try to talk to me, though. "You could come hang out with us tonight. We could show you a real good time, if you know what I mean." No thanks. I'm good. I have plans already." Well, the tall one started to get very upset that his moves weren't working like he'd hoped they would. He started to use a more threatening tone and moved in very close to me, about 2 inches away. I tried to ignore him and stay focused on the scanner. He was so close I could smell that he hadn't showered in a few days. He got a bit louder and said, "I see how it is. You only fuck doctors and rich men like that. You think you're too good for us. We can show you that you aren't. We can teach you a lesson." Now, I'm not sure in what context he meant that, but I'm sure there also wasn't any context that it was good. Still not looking at him, I turned away so my body was blocking his view of my purse, which I set on the scanner. I grabbed my 4-inch pocket knife out and slid it up my jacket sleeve, just in case I needed to protect myself. I acted like I was searching for my wallet. I do this, however, in view of the self-scan worker
standing at her podium. I looked at her with wide eyes, trying to silently communicate that I did not feel safe, and I might soon need her help. I turned back to the machine and slid my credit card to pay, while the creepy and hostile guys were practically standing right on top of me. The machine malfunctioned and started beeping. The lady worker came over immediately, and the guys standing next to me changed their expressions from "I'm planning to torture you for a couple of days and toss your body in a creek" to "just your friendly good old country boys making polite conversation over here." They even tried to act like I knew them and we were friends, so the worker wouldn't be alerted to their ill intentions. They even tried joking with the worker, saying I was stealing something, and that's why the machine went off. Well, the worker definitely was not buying it. She was a 6-foot-tall woman with some muscle on her. I wouldn't mess with her on my best day. Anyway, she pressed a few buttons on the screen, shooting the guys a very unimpressed look when they were trying to act charming, and canceled the order completely. She turned to me and said, "I'm sorry for your inconvenience, ma'am. This machine seems to not be working correctly. Why don't you take your things and I'll ring you up at the actual register." She put her hand on my back and gave me a wide-eyed look like I gave her a minute earlier, letting me know she saw the danger. I picked my things up to follow her to a register that was near the security office. The guys lingered around the self-scan, still staring at me. Eventually they completed their purchase, but stood still at the exit, assuming that they were waiting for me. I felt like I would be walking to my death if I made my exit in that moment. The worker kept a close eye on them and started scanning my items. As she was scanning, she told me there really wasn't anything wrong with the machine I was using. It just misread my credit card. I had a bad feeling about those guys from the moment they walked in. Then I saw them getting aggressive towards you. I already rang security to be ready to walk you out to the parking lot and make sure you left safely when you're ready to leave. When I saw you take that knife out and put it up your sleeve getting ready to protect yourself, good girl. As much as I'd like to see you show them they picked the wrong chick to mess with though, I'm glad I was able to pull you aside and make sure you're safe. I can see him waiting by the door for you, so I'll just keep pressing buttons on the screen and act like I'm having some trouble with your order or something until they go away. I thought to myself, this woman seriously deserves a raise. I thanked her over and over again and told her what they'd said to me. I was getting afraid because I didn't know what these men were capable of. Well, as I'm talking to her, the bar manager calls me to see what's going on. I explained what was happening. He was obviously quite concerned, and even got ready to come there himself and kick their asses. A sweet sentiment indeed. By the time I had hung up, the guys had given up though, and walked out to the parking lot. The worker told me to give it another few minutes, because she had a feeling they may still be there, waiting for me to walk out and see which vehicle was mine so they could follow me. My instant thought was, no way, they must be gone by now. Of course, I was wrong. The worker and security guard escorted me out. As it was after midnight, you can imagine just how empty the parking lot was. Back toward the end of the lot, there sat an old big pickup truck, running with the lights pointed toward the store. It was a huge parking lot, and it wouldn't have made sense for them to initially park like that. I assumed they moved the truck to sit that way so they had a full view of when I exited the store to go to my vehicle. It was like being stalked by very hungry lions. When I unlocked my car, and they saw that me, the worker, and the guard were looking directly at them, and I wasn't getting in my car until we watched them leave, they peeled out of the parking lot. I mean, they seriously did a burnout to establish that they were pissed and trying to intimidate us or something. Poor creeps didn't get their way. Boo-hoo. I thanked the worker and the guard over and over again, as I was certain they had just saved my life, or at least saved me from having to live with whatever those guys were planning to do to me. I also wrote a long letter to the store manager and their corporate location, describing how the employees protected me and how grateful I was. I really hope that went a good way to earning them a promotion, a bonus, or at least something. She didn't know me at all, and was still ready to protect me, which really wasn't her job, but she did it anyways. Needless to say, I don't go late-night shopping by myself anymore, and I never will again. To understand my story, you sorta have to know a tiny bit about trespassing laws in our country. Basically, we don't have any, so long as you're respectful and non-destructive at least. You can walk over any hills you like, and in my case, camp on any beach of your choosing, so long as once you leave, the area is exactly like how you found it. I used to love camping when I was little. Our family would go multiple times a year with a very large group of my parents' friends and their kids. On average, there were maybe 10 of us at a time, which was a bit of a logistical challenge, since we always headed out to this one really remote beach on the coast. Actually, we weren't the only ones either. There were always yachts bobbing just off the shore with people in them, and other campers lining up and down the beach. Most of them also had children or teenagers, so it wasn't a wild party scene kind of place. More like a very informal family holiday spot. There was even a small building with toilets and showers installed nearby, even though this place was in the middle of nowhere. I guess the local council must have figured it out and gotten sick of people peeing behind bushes. We took a trip up in spring of 2011. I'm really bad with time, but I know this because I got my dog in winter of 2010, after picking her out that November from the shelter as a birthday gift from me to me, as I paid her adoption fee. Reddit, I know you love dogs, and she will be very important to the story later on, so let me tell you a little bit about Parmesan. Parmesan came to me as a 6-month-old puppy who had been rescued from a dog-fighting situation. We're not entirely sure what breed she is exactly, but my best guess is a Lurcher Staffy mix. She's a wonderfully well-tempered dog with people, and most dogs. But of course, you absolutely do not threaten her or she'll have you. So, by the time of this camping trip, I'd had Parmesan for a few months. She'd never come camping with us before, but as far as my family are concerned, dogs go on camping trips too. So when we all piled into the car, she came along right with us. Unusually though, this time none of the family friends could make it, so it was only me, my sister, my dad, and my mom. I didn't mind though. I wasn't really that attached to the other kids. I'd rather play with my dog and my sister. The drive took the best part of 6 hours, and because we'd left a bit later than usual, although I don't remember exactly why, we arrived right around sunset. Not exactly a good time to be building a tent, but we'd expected to arrive to other campers already set up and the beach completely illuminated in campfires. This time, the beach was empty. In spite of this, my parents started taking stuff out and trying to build the tent. They asked us to fetch some of the lighter bags from the boot of the car, while they sat pointing a flashlight at the sand to see properly. I rolled down the window of the car for Parmesan before getting out. It was pretty hot for that time of year, and I wanted her to have some air. Always gotta be looking out for my furry little homie after all. As we're fumbling about in the dark on a beach in the middle of nowhere where it's pretty spooky, the one road that led to this beach was circular and had a bridge over the water, meaning you could basically circle around the beach in a big O shape if you felt like it. I wasn't really paying any attention to the road. I was complaining, I was tired as kids are wont to do, but my mom was. After maybe 15 minutes of my dad trying to nail the tent into the sand, my mom started asking him, "Hey, have you seen that car drive around? It's been by a few times." My dad just kind of shrugged her off sorta like that. I don't know if he said anything back to her, but after a few more minutes, I did see a car pull up next to ours on the road, and someone got out. It was maybe 15 or 20 feet from the cars to where we were, and the lighting was pretty low except for the torches. We weren't expecting to see anyone else out here at this point, and I think my mom said something like, "Must be security." I was skeptical though. Why would a random beach have security just for it? I think what she meant was the Wildlife Trust or something, as they do occasionally come down to do their nosy business. The guy was walking pretty unevenly. He must have been drunk or high or something, because he had that stagger to him. There was absolutely no way this guy was sober. Cool. A junkie. Not an unusual find, but it was rare to just see them in the wild. As he walked into flashlight range, we realized he was carrying a large knife, maybe 15 inches. Although I was small at the time, so maybe my sense of scale was a bit off. I don't like my dad, but credit to him. Once he saw this, he got up immediately, holding on to the camping mallet, and put us all behind him. The man began to shout wildly at us, saying we couldn't camp here, and he was just letting us know. My dad tried initially to be a bit low-key with the guy, and told him that it was fine. We'd leave. But this didn't work. The man kept advancing on us, so my dad started shouting, and the man started shouting back. My sister and I were crying. I remember shaking. I was utterly terrified, as I'm sure anyone would be in that situation. It really did seem like this guy and my dad were going to fight it out, and to be honest, I didn't fancy my dad's chances. While it's grim to consider, I'm absolutely convinced he would have killed my dad, and possibly us as well once he was done, as I don't think my mother would have had the common sense to run with us. I love her to bits, but she's always put Dad and her relationship with him above us. This isn't how it went down, though. A bolt from the black, like a wolf descending on its prey, took us all by surprise, most of all the man with the knife. In that moment, Parmesan was the apex predator large canines represent in nature. She got him good by the arm, clamped down hard, ripping his jacket and shredding the skin underneath. He dropped the knife, as he had been holding it in the arm she had just grabbed him by. He kicked her and punched at her, and eventually managed to get her off. He grabbed the knife from the sand, and ran back to his car and drove off. Parmesan did not follow him. She stayed with us, muzzle covered in blood. Quickly as we could, we gathered our things and all got back in the car, all pretty shook up over this incident. I gave Parmy a quick once-over. She was okay, but the car's window was much more open than I'd left it. We think what happened was when the shouting started, she must have put her paws up on the gap I'd left for her, as it was an old car and had the roll-down windows and not an electric button. She must have been able to hit it with her paws with enough force to put it down enough to squeeze out. That's not the end of my story, though. We were all pretty scared, and since we had the dog with us, we couldn't book into a hotel for the night. My parents decided to just drive home so we could all feel safe. But first, we had to drive into the nearest town for petrol, as they were kind of low. I spent the time trying to clean Parmesan up a little. I'd always loved dogs, but what she'd just done for me blew my mind. As we drove into town, we came across a petrol station, but it looked closed. My dad drove up closer to get a better look, and stuck his head out the window to get a better look at the sign. My mom asked him what on earth he was doing, and he told her he was trying to see when it opens. My heart fucking sank. Parked in a corner, behind a van so we hadn't seen him at first, was that man with a knife. He was sitting on the bonnet of his car, using some tissue paper to clean up his arm. It honestly looked pretty bad. Without stopping to refuel or look anywhere else in town, my dad drove right out of there. He decided to go to the next town over, but this was the wrong move. The next town over turned out to be 60 miles away. He didn't have that much petrol, we realized, as we began driving. We were going to break down midway. That's fine, Dad said. We had AA cover. They'd come tow us home, or at least to somewhere acceptable for the night. Better than staying in the last town, at least. After driving for maybe 5 minutes or so, lights flash us from behind. Another car. The same car the man had been driving. It was him, following us. He must have realized we were low on petrol. The next half hour was one of the worst in my life. I had a complete and utter breakdown, as did everyone else really. I could tell my parents were trying to keep it under wraps so it wouldn't upset us, but we weren't really small kids. We were both double digits, so we knew how dangerous this situation was. My dad turned off the radio to conserve petrol, and the man followed us for 55 miles before he peeled away onto another road. Our fuel meter was on the big red E for empty for the last 10, and we were driving on fumes. I don't really believe in God, but if he does really exist, that must have been one of his miracles. Once we got there, we drove into a petrol station and refilled to a full tank before driving the rest of the way home. My sister and I slept in the car after that. I only woke up once we made it all the way home, just grateful nothing worse had happened. After getting some sleep, my mom phoned the non-emergency line for the police and reported what had happened. They never got back to her after that, but apparently the woman she spoke to said that they may wish to in the future, as he matched the description given of a suspect wanted in relation to a murder charge. No idea if he actually was that guy or just a random psycho. As I said, they never got back to her. So, what's the takeaway from this story then? Well, for me, it's that I really love Parmesan. She's still with us now, old as the hills and twice as grizzled as one of my mom's friends likes to joke. I don't know why she did what she did that day. I couldn't tell you what her thought process was. What I do know is that this poor puppy was born into an environment where they abused and neglected her, only to be rescued and taken to a shelter where her mother and siblings all found homes before her. Despite how badly people had treated her, when I took her home she forgave, but never forgot. I think the saying is, I never trust a person who doesn't like a dog, but I always trust a dog when they don't like a person, you know? They have a very good understanding of human body language. I think she must have understood just how much danger we were in. By way of background, I live in Milwaukee, which has the honor of being the most racially segregated city in the entire country. It's a cool city overall, don't get me wrong, but we have some really shitty inner city with a ton of poverty and violence, and also gang activity. At the time this happened, I was living in a sort of in-between area. Not quite the ghetto, but not exactly a super nice area either. I was a 22-year-old single mom. I lived in a ground floor apartment on one of the main streets. I parked in the back alley behind the building. My front door faced the street and I had a side door too, with a walk running between my building and the one next door. Anyway, I got home in the middle of the afternoon on a Saturday with my kid. As we drove down the alley to get to my parking spot, I saw this guy in a hoodie sort of lurking around by where I parked. It was weird because it was quite warm outside and he had his hood all the way up, but there were a bunch of gangster wannabe kids in the neighborhood, so whatever. It was definitely an odd place to just be standing though. As I got close to the building and started pulling into my parking spot, he turned around and started walking toward the street, past my side door. He had definitely left because I'd just arrived. I figured he was smoking a blunt or something. I didn't think anything of it. I got my son and some bags out of the car. I went the same way the guy had just taken, to my side door. I didn't see him at all. My son and I went inside, and I was in the process of putting stuff down when my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I immediately thought that it must be that guy. Being young and naive, I answered the front door. It was the same guy, still with his hood up. He immediately smiled at me, but not in a friendly way, more of a leer. He looked to be about 16, cornrows with a fake gold grill that was studded with these little fake diamonds. I regretted opening the door, but here I was, so I went with it. "Hi." He kept staring at me and said nothing. At this point, I saw another kid in a hoodie pacing behind him on the sidewalk and looking at us. I was quickly realizing this was not a good situation. My son, who I had momentarily forgotten about, came up behind me. He did the shy kid thing, where he stood behind me and poked his head out from behind my butt to look at the guy. The hoodie dude glanced at him for a couple of seconds, then back at me. "Yo, is Danielle around?" "I don't know who that is. Maybe try the other door." I gestured to my neighbor's door to my left. "You sure?" "Yeah, sorry." He left, walking in the opposite direction of my neighbor's door. Hoodie dude number 2 followed behind him. I thought it was really weird that they didn't even try to check the door for Danielle. I thought this whole thing was really weird, to be honest. My boyfriend got to my apartment a few minutes later, and I was really glad to see him. He had a really old Jeep that he always parked out front on the main street. When he went out to get something from his car shortly after he had arrived, it was gone. Fuck. Car theft was a pretty common thing in this neighborhood, but stealing it from the main street in broad daylight was pretty damn ballsy. We called the cops, filed a report, the whole 9 yards. I told the cop about the hoodie dudes, since it seemed like it could be important. I was able to give a good description of the guy who came to my door asking for Danielle. I had no idea if it would really be relevant, but the fact that the Jeep was stolen shortly after these guys were around seemed pretty suspicious. And that's where the story ended. At least until 2 days later. I got a call from a different cop with the downtown precinct. They told me they had found the Jeep, and other than the ignition, it wasn't really damaged. Yay! He asked if I could come downtown to do a lineup, see if I could identify the people who had knocked on my door right before the Jeep got taken. That was pretty weird. A lineup for a stolen car? But I agreed. He asked if I could come down in a couple of days. Also weird, why wouldn't they want me to do it right away? I was mostly focused, though, on the fact that doing a lineup was pretty fucking cool. So there I go down to the precinct a couple of days later. The way this went seemed sort of unorthodox, but I guess it was what it was. 2 detectives took me into a dark room where a woman in her 50s was sitting with a young woman in a wheelchair. The young woman's lower leg was in a giant cast with this big metal contraption surrounding it, maybe a dozen metal rods going into the cast itself. At this point, I had no idea what was happening. The detectives instructed us that we weren't to say anything during the lineup, except if we wanted the guys to turn around again or whatever, and we couldn't talk to each other at all. Okay. We ended up having to wait in the room for almost an hour in the dark, awkwardly not speaking. They explained it was taking more time than anticipated to get 12 guys from the jail over to the precinct. Finally, though, we got started. They did 2 lineups and gave us forms to mark 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. There was a large window in front of us, and they explained that the guys couldn't see us. They turned the lights on in the room behind that window and brought each guy in individually. I couldn't personally identify anyone in the first lineup. I felt sort of bad, actually, but I just couldn't. The second lineup started, and I didn't recognize guys 1, 2, or 3. Number 4 came out, though, and I immediately recognized the dude who had knocked on my door. He didn't have his stupid-looking grill anymore, but it was definitely the same guy. After the second lineup was done, they brought the other 2 men into the hallway and told me to stay put. After a few minutes, they came back to get me. The detectives asked if I recognized anyone. I told them I was sure about number 4 in the second, but couldn't identify anyone in the first. From what I gathered by this point, that hoodie dude number 2 must have been in the first lineup, but I hadn't ever gotten a good look at him while he was pacing on the sidewalk. They had me sign 2 forms, 1 for each lineup, with the second form identifying number 4 as hoodie dude number 1. When I gave the forms back, the detective told me that they could tell me what was actually going on now that the lineup was done. Good, because I was confused as fuck by this point. He explained that number 4 was indeed one of the guys they arrested with my boyfriend's Jeep. The guys had stolen the Jeep and driven to a nearby part of town, into a quiet and lily-white neighborhood. I'm also white, so this could be relevant. And they came across a young couple unloading groceries from their car. The young woman with the leg contraption was the female half of that couple. They parked the stolen Jeep behind them, got out, and immediately shot them both. They shot the woman in the leg, and shot the young man right in his dick. He was still in the hospital in bad condition, which is why he wasn't there. The older woman was the girl's mom and had brought her from the hospital to do the lineup. The reason it was delayed a couple of days was because she had an emergency surgery to try to repair the damage to her leg. The guys didn't demand anything from the couple or take anything from them after the shooting. They just immediately shot them. The young woman managed to remember the license plate number of the Jeep, and they were apprehended in a corner store when a cop saw the stolen car parked outside shortly after the shooting. The shooters were both teenagers, but were being charged as adults. One of them had stupidly talked a bit before lawyering up, and had told the detective that it was a gang initiation. They had to shoot a white person. That was the price of admission. They had stolen my boyfriend's car after taking the bus out to the street I lived on. They figured it would be easier to get away if they had some wheels. The detectives were pretty sure I had been the original target of opportunity, but couldn't explain why they hadn't gone through with it. Nerves, they guessed. I knew why, though. It was because he had seen my kid peeking out from behind me. They told me I might have to testify if the case went to court, and told me I'd hear from the DA's office when they needed me. A couple of months later, one of the detectives called me and told me that the hoodie dudes pled out to attempted murder charges in exchange for reduced time. The guy who got shot in the dick luckily survived. I didn't ask how many years they got, but I assume they're probably still in prison these 13 years later. As an ironic postscript to this story, my boyfriend had the same Jeep stolen from the same spot in front of my apartment about 4 months later, also in broad daylight. That time they didn't find it right away, though. He was staying over at my house weeks later when he got a call around 2 a.m. from the MPD arson unit. They had torched it and left it in the middle of the street in a notoriously violent area of the city. We decided to move after that.
I was 11 years old. At the time, I was living in an apartment situated on a street with ongoing construction. Needless to say, they often tapped into the electric supply, and the power fluctuated quite a bit. Therefore, the streetlights often served no real purpose, especially in the winters when evening dawned on us with pitch-black darkness. That is relevant, so keep it in mind. From what I remember, it was a weekend I was supposed to spend at a friend's house. For an 11-year-old me, this was an exciting prospect, having been loaded with schoolwork the entire week. I was to spend what I believed to be Friday night sleeping over, and spend the entirety of Saturday at her bungalow, to return home that very evening. What made it even better was the fact that her parents had an event they couldn't avoid, and therefore trusted us to stay alone in their 2-floor house for the entirety of the 6 hours they were gone. Back then, the idea of spending a whole night alone with my friend was great. No interference, and a whole 6 hours of games and movies on their huge TV. As it turns out, my friend had other ideas. I arrived at her house just short of 8 p.m. It was already pretty dark out, and our parents had waited for me to arrive before telling us about emergency contacts, dinner, and all that. They also reminded us to get their 4-year-old Labrador inside as the weather was acting up, and his kennel had a few loose panels which leaked when it rained. This is also an important fact to be noted. After they left, we watched a few cartoons, had dinner, and were chilling in our living room playing cards. That's when my friend Sid had the ingenious idea of exploring a fenced plot of land a few hundred meters down the street that she resided on. There was no construction happening in there, so what little of that area didn't have shambles was overgrown with plants and weeds. We got the dog inside, leashed it to its long chain that allowed it to roam within reason, got the keys, and left the house to make the short 10-minute trip. At this point, it was about 10 p.m. In retrospect, this is where we still had a chance to avoid this particular encounter, but being the curious and daring 11-year-olds we were, we ventured anyways. Rather uneventfully, we arrived, and set to climbing over the 2-meter wall. Luckily for us, the wall was broken enough in places to make good holds to carry us over. Once inside, Sid suggested that we sit a few meters away from each other for as long as we could, until one of us was too scared to do so. We faced each other and walked backwards, till there was just enough light to see the general silhouette of the other. After what seemed to me like a good 10 minutes, I saw Sid's hunched form rise up and start to walk towards me. She seemed to be walking rather fast and in a haphazard manner, jumping over rocks and such at a daring pace, even getting cut by thorns in the process. She came up to me, and just as I was about to laugh and call her out on being scared, she told me to get up because she needed to go feed Shaggy. I remember being really confused, because her parents had already filled his bowl with food, and he had this water thing which he could operate in case he was thirsty. But I saw her face, and let me just say I've never seen her look this pale. It looked like she had seen a ghost. So without asking questions, I said okay, and we made our way back over the wall, albeit in a tense manner and rather quickly. The moment my feet touched the ground, I felt Sid grab my arm and start sprinting down the street. To put things into perspective, I had a bruise from how hard she grasped it for 2 weeks straight. So we ran like hell was chasing us, arrived at her house and went in through her front yard fence gate, a towering metal gate without bars, and she told me to unlock the front door while she deadbolted the metal gate's various locks into the ground. At this point, I was starting to panic, but we got into the house, and then Sid proceeded to run around the house locking and closing all windows and doors, as well as pulling the curtain shut tight. I was very confused as to why she was doing this, and so was her dog, who stood there and followed her around while she did so. After about 10 minutes, she came back into the ground floor living room, and with a very scared expression, she explained to me that the reason she did all that was because while we were sitting apart, she happened to glance away from a few meters to my right to see another human silhouette crouching in the bushes. She thought she was imagining it, until it moved closer to where I was sitting, and seemed to be unaware that my friend could see them. She didn't want to startle me or the person, and so she made up having to feed the dog as an excuse to get out of there without alerting the person still crouching. After hearing this, I was quite shaken, and we hugged for a few minutes, deciding not to tell our parents, as they had very much warned us not to go out of her compound. We didn't want this to be the last of our time alone together having fun, so we peeked out the window and into the street, which seemed to be empty, as far as we could see. We proceeded to put it behind us, as excitement took over our minds once again. I would have loved to say that was the end of it, but what happens next has stuck with me to date, and I hold a fear of that situation from that point onward. To give you an idea of the layout of her compound, her house was surrounded on 2 sides by a lawn, and the lawn was then surrounded by a wall some 2.5 meters high. The wall had one entrance, which were the tall metal gates I had talked about previously. The house itself had windows all around the perimeter, as well as 2 potential entrances, the first being the front door, while the second being a door to this small attached space next to the house, which was made of see-through metal, like the kind which some metal fences are made of, but a bit stronger. The space had a metal door with a lock only accessible from the inside, as well as a door which was on the wall this space was attached to inside. However, the door only had a deadbolt on, and it was made of light wood. So an hour or so in after the incident, we were upstairs in her air-conditioned room, playing games on her computer, and talking about whatever it is 11-year-olds talk about, when we heard the dog bark downstairs. It was growling, and seemed to bark at random intervals. Keep in mind that her dog was a friendly Labrador, who rarely ever growled or barked aggressively. My friend went to get the dog upstairs to her room, and after she returned, she informed me that the dog was standing next to the front door growling at it, and that it took her quite a bit of effort to get him upstairs, as he kept trying to return to the door. We were really confused, as this was unusual for him to do, and thinking that a stray dog might have caught his attention, we decided to go into the balcony attached to her room. It gave us a view into the front lawn, and a part of the street directly in front of the house. Instead of seeing what we assumed would be a stray dog or cat, we looked down to see a man standing very still in her lawn, right in front of her front door. In the limited light, we could make out heavy layers of muddy clothing and a full head of hair that looked very matted. The dog was with us in the balcony and was whining to be let outside. We crouched down there, and right as we were about to discuss what we should do, we heard what sounded like the front door rattling, as if someone was trying to open with the handle. We creeped back downstairs, only to realize that this person had now moved on to the window next to the door and was trying to open that. The realization hit that he was trying to find an entrance into the house by going around the perimeter. Just as we were about to creep back upstairs, my friend grabbed me again, and in a hushed tone told me she had forgotten to lock the attached space door in her hurry before. We both looked at each other and paled, as we realized it would gain the intruder easy access into the house. The inner door had nothing but a deadbolt. At this point, we heard the windows rattling behind the house, nearly 3/4 of the way back to the front again. The attached side door was a few meters away from the front door, and we were lucky that he had chosen to go around to the other side. She told me to wait by the inner door with the dog, while she went outside and bolted the metal door. She then informed me to close the door as soon as she returned, and that if she was caught, to let the dog outside and to close the inner door as discreetly as possible, to not give myself away. We were both terrified, and since we had no time to argue about it, I stood guard at the inner door while she went to the outer, fumbled with the lock, and returned inside practically running as quietly as she could. We closed the inner door, and just then we heard the outer door start to rattle harshly. Had she not gone there and then, there was a big chance we would have had no choice but to hide in her house as he found his way in. After that, he tried opening all the doors and windows, which took a while as he was doing it quite intently and forcefully. We found our way back upstairs and went into her balcony to see if he had finally gone away. We stood near the foot of her stairs for a while, listening for any further activity. As we looked down, we saw him once again standing in her front lawn. However, we could see his head was tilted back, and it felt like he was looking right at us. We knew that it was too dark for him to be able to spot us, as along with closing all the windows and such, we had proceeded to kill the lights in her room, as well as draw the curtains so her little bedside lamp wouldn't escape the blinds. He then started giggling in the quiet of the night, and proceeded to go down on all fours, crawling around the lawn in front of the house while his laughter grew. In retrospect, we should have called the authorities at this point, but being terrified 11-year-olds, we didn't want to get into trouble for not even being able to follow simple instructions. The man did this for nearly half an hour, only to stand up once again facing the street, climb on top of the kennel in the corner, up to the top of the wall, and jump down. We stood still in her balcony waiting to see if he would return, but an hour or so passed where he didn't. That was the last time we saw him the entirety of the night, till at around 2 a.m. her parents returned. The next morning they were very confused as to why all the doors and windows were closed on such a pleasant night, and why there was mud on the front doorknob. We said we just wanted to play in the dark inside the house, lying about the actuality of the situation, and to this day I do not think the man has been caught. This happened around 2004, when I was in my mid-20s, and my sister, the unfortunate main character in this story, had just turned 21. At the time, she and her boyfriend lived with my fiancé and I. On weekends, we went out to one of 2 bars that had karaoke, air hockey, and the like. This particular night, we were at the bar further out from where we lived in the city, a good half an hour by car. Everyone was having drinks, socializing with people we knew. It was one of those places with lots of regulars. Singing karaoke. Nothing out of the ordinary, really, except that night, my sister started hanging out with these 2 older ladies who had a liquor store in their purses, and were quite sharing, although I didn't know it at the time. As she tended to drink a lot more than me, that was a score for her, less money spent on drinks, but she ended up far more hammered than usual. Towards the end of the night, around 1:45, she was really very drunk. The aforementioned fiancé, my sister's BF, and I were in a heated air hockey game, planning to leave as soon as it was over. She walked up to us and said she was going to smoke a cigarette outside. Nothing unusual, everybody did. Until we were done. About 5 minutes later, we paid our tab and walked out, but she was not on the porch area where smokers congregated. Okay, weird, but not too alarming. We went out back of the bar to check for her, inside, in the restroom, in the large parking lot. It's notable that this particular bar was in a business park, so there were multiple businesses that were closed, as well as the Mexican restaurant next door that had just closed as well. We searched, asked everyone that knew us, and those who didn't if they had seen her, but nobody had. I asked the workers from the restaurant that were sitting outside as well. They seemed nervous when telling me they hadn't seen her, but I didn't think on that much till later. By then, I was in full-on panic after trying to call her cell about 15 times only to have it go to voicemail. Being a bit inebriated myself, I started searching for her. I went as far as to take off my heels and start running down the highway searching, as honestly, there had been times she would start walking home in the past, though never from this place, as it was very far away from where we lived. The fiancé and her boyfriend thought we should go to the house to see if she got someone to bring her home. It seemed unlikely, but not unheard of. We get home, and she's still nowhere to be found. Just as we were about to head back, and I was going to phone the police, I received a call from the police department on my phone. They indicated that they had my sister, and that there had been an incident, and I needed to get down there. We rushed to the police department, where we were taken into a room with my sister. Her face was red from obvious crying, and bruises were starting to show on her arms and chest. She said that when she told us she was going outside, she thought we said we were leaving then, so she walked to the car. After a few minutes, being drunk and tired, she sat down against it to wait. A van pulled up, and a young man started asking her directions to somewhere. She walked closer to try and explain, when suddenly the back door flew open, and 2 other men grabbed her and threw her in, taking off. They were rough with her, hitting her a few times while holding her down, saying that they only wanted money. They snatched her purse from her, breaking the straps and searched it, quite haphazardly as they didn't find the $30 she had in it. After driving around a bit speaking in Spanish she couldn't understand, they pulled out a gun, making sure she saw it, and put a bandana around her eyes telling her they'd let her go. She was driven to some woods by a neighborhood she did not know. The door was opened and they pushed her out, telling her to run, that if she took the blindfold off or turned around they'd shoot her. She ran and ran. Eventually she did take the blindfold off and came to the first door she saw, beating on it and screaming for help. The police were called. She was picked up, and now we're back to my being there, hearing what I feared had happened. A report was filed. The police did a search and did locate the bandana she ripped off, but she was so intoxicated and terrified, she wasn't able to give a clear description of the van other than a white older model, or the 3 occupants other than young Mexican men. The investigation turned up nothing, as no cameras caught any of this. Hell, we even had detectives in our home who said, "Look, we need the truth. If you got drunk and just went home with someone and didn't want your boyfriend to find out, we will file charges on you." Aside from the bruises, broken purse, and her trauma, there was nothing concrete to go on. That was unpleasant. I'm still fairly convinced someone at the restaurant knew something, given their suspicious behaviors when I asked about her, but the police were never able to find that link. All said and done, the guys were never found. Eventually, we just moved on, in different states. It's now just a story in our lives. It just makes me sick thinking what could have happened, but thankfully, it didn't. This is to recount some unsettling events I went through during my college years, as well as the most amazing example of the bro sixth sense I've ever witnessed. So, without further ado, meet Kevin. Kevin was a colleague of mine and was in the same group as me, which meant we had maybe 5 or 6 subjects per year together. Kevin was a bit odd. Not that there was something wrong with him physically. He was adorable. A bit nerdy, a bit on the shorter, scrawny side, with some blonde hair, big blue eyes, and like 3 fluffy hairs on his chin instead of facial hair. If I had to compare him to something, I'd say he looked like a cute, soft baby chicken, if baby chickens were mentally inclined to grow into serial killers. More on that later. At first, I didn't really notice him. There were a lot of people in my class. Everything was new, and I personally didn't know anyone, except for a guy named Harper, whom I knew from my sports days. We'd often compete against each other, exchanged colorful insults on the track, and then go get drinks together. As I've said, I only knew Harper, and there were only 6 other girls in my class, as I've attended classes that held little interest among the female college population. During that time, I made friends and got really chummy with 3 more geeky guys. Zachary, who I even casually dated for a short time. Steve, we realized our mothers went to college together too. Instant friendship. And Rick, with whom I shared many interests. So, to count it down, the important people so far are Harper, Zachary, Steve, and Rick. These people are important because they would later become my personal army. And then there was Kevin. Damn cute Kevin, who I made the mistake of asking if he had any notes picked up from the first half of a lecture I missed because I overslept. In Kevin speak, "Hey, got the notes from this morning?" Apparently translated into, "I have an interest in you, oh magnificent Kevin. Nothing would make me happier than knowing I've caught your eye." I borrowed his notes, partially copied them, and returned his notebook back. What I didn't see was that Kevin then sniffed the notebook when I had my back turned. Zachary noticed it first, and snort-laughed about it later, because my first reaction to it when he told me was to sniff myself and see if I stank or something. I was young and naive then, so the sniffing came off less as what's wrong with him and more as what's wrong with me. And that's where it all went downhill. Over the next few weeks, Kevin would always be there. Never talking to anyone precisely, just kind of staring me down when we were in class, when we had breaks, and when we went to the coffee shop outside. Then he started showing up for classes we didn't attend together, and he simply arrived too early for his later classes. He never participated, he just sat there in the back of the room. Kevin also had sort of an aura about him. Like you didn't have to look at the door to know when he entered the room. You just felt his eyes on the back of your head, and kind of wished for a shower. Anyway, I didn't worry too much. Until one day I went to the women's bathroom during a break. I did my business, went to the front section to wash my hands. In came Kevin. I was alone. Kevin turned and closed the door behind him, and locked them shut. Needless to say, I was confused and unsure of what to do, so I just stared at him and asked him if he needed something. "Hi," he said, then proceeded with, "How are you?" Like he hadn't just locked himself in the woman's bathroom with me for no fathomable reason. I realized quickly that something was very, very wrong with the situation, and attempted not to panic, managing to keep up a nonchalant expression and turn towards the mirror, so I could still see him. I pretended to fix my makeup. "Fine," I said, and spoke no more. I could see Kevin fidgeting, playing with the key nervously, and after a long and uncomfortable silence, I heard a loud banging from the other side of the door. It was Harper and Steve. Harper yelling something like, "Kevin, get your scrawny ass over here and open that door, or I swear to God, that door ain't gonna be the only thing I'm breaking." I could hear Steve behind him, sounding a bit panicked and yelling at him to move, since he had managed to get the spare key. Kevin paled and stepped away, the key he had falling somewhere to the floor. Steve and Harper unlocked the door, and Harper jumped on Kevin like a damn primate and knocked him to the floor, while Steve and Rick, who was there as well, got inside and all but dragged me out of the bathroom area. None of them wanted to tell me what, or why, or even how any of that had happened, but I pushed at the weakest link, Rick, when we were alone. I found out that a whole hour prior to all of that, Rick overheard Kevin asking one of the on-campus students, the guys who get some extra cash if they help with paperwork, fixing, and cleaning the campus, for the ladies' bathroom key and paying him for it. Rick didn't know why the hell Kevin would need that key, but he knew Kevin was a weirdo, so he figured it couldn't be good. Later on, Steve was looking for me, and asked Rick if he had seen me, and things kind of clicked fast for Rick. They asked around, and people told them they saw me go into the bathroom area and that I hadn't come out yet. More confirmed that they saw Kevin going there too, and joked that we must have had a make-out session or something. Steve immediately connected the dots. Harper overheard him talking to Rick, and they all went to break me free from Kevin's affections. Kevin appeared with a slightly black eye in class 2 days later, and just wishing to forget the whole thing, I decided to pretend he did not exist. I wish this was the end of it. Maybe a week or two went by. I figured he learned his lesson. He was leaving me alone. But then he got the wind in his sails back for some reason, and proceeded with attempting to sit next to me in class. He was so insistent that Zachary got involved, and now the guys made a timetable, so 2 and 2 would attend all classes at times when I was there, so each could sit on either side of me. I never asked this of them, they just insisted. After a few failed attempts, Kevin gave up and settled for sitting in the back, glaring at my back and the 2 guys on duty that day. I wish this was the end of it. 2 weeks of that later, Kevin either didn't show up for class at all or left early. I hoped he'd found some other interests and that it was finally over. Hell no. I noticed now Kevin was following me to the bus station. It took just one time to see him standing inconspicuously behind the newspaper stand to freak out and call Steve, as he lived nearby. Steve picked me up and drove me home. The next morning, Harper called me at around 9 a.m. and went, "Are you in my class at 10 today?" Yeah. "Pack your shit and wait for me at the end of your street. Kevin is waiting for you at the bus station." This went on for some 5 days, as the guys extended their bro services to now accompanying me literally at all times, before, during, and after class. That day, Kevin showed up to class looking roughed up, but now stared at me with so much hate I could barely cope, and finally, after some sound advice from Harper and Rick, decided to bring this shit to college authorities. The pro dean immediately transferred Kevin to a completely different group, so our classes never overlapped again. I stopped seeing Kevin all the time, and reached my final year in college. By now, Zachary and Steve had moved away. Harper had finished early and no longer attended classes, so it was only me and Rick now. But it was okay, since Kevin was no longer there. I wish this was the end of it. Rick and I finished college, graduated, and decided to celebrate by visiting a medieval fair in Rick's hometown that summer. We agreed to get some drinks for old time's sake. All was well. We had a great time as we toured the fair a bit, and suddenly, Rick, the sweet, polite Rick, says, "Son of a bitch, Isn't that Kevin?" It was. Kevin was there, staring at us, before turning on his heels and leaving. We saw him a few more times. I started to panic, thinking he was following me again, so Rick was already dialing a few of his friends to come over. But suddenly, Kevin got lost, and I never, ever saw him again. So I, 19 and female, was at a house party a couple of days ago. I only really knew a few people there, and it was pretty packed. I hung around with my 2 friends there for a while, having some drinks. After a while, my friends went into this room that everyone was hotboxing in. I didn't go because I didn't really feel like drinking and being stoned at a party where I barely knew anyone. So I just mingled for a bit, then went on my phone talking to my other friends. I noticed this guy that keeps staring me up and down, and instantly felt my stomach sink. I'm no stranger to people trying to catch my eye to strike a conversation or flirt, but I instantly had a bad feeling about this guy. I looked back down at my phone and sent my location to my friends, just letting them know where I was because things were changing from feeling chill to suddenly sketchy. There were a bunch of cans of soda in the kitchen, so I got up to go grab a Sprite instead of having any more drinks. I brought my own alcohol. I'll never take drinks from strangers. As I'm there, the same guy that kept looking at me comes in and starts trying to get me to take this drink in a red Solo cup. I told him no. He kept trying, though, and I was getting annoyed because he kept being super pushy. I started to be pretty blunt. "Look, I don't want your drink or your company," and walked away. I thought that'd be the end of it, and pushed it to the back of my mind as one of my friends came out from the hotbox room, stoned and pretty happy. We hung out some more, and my friend wanted a cigarette, so I went out on the balcony with her. As we're there, she put her cigarettes on the ledge, and as she's talking animatedly, her arm pushed her cigarettes off and they fell down into the yard. I was gonna go downstairs and outside with her to go get them, but she told me she had to grab something from her car anyways, and that she'd be right back. I decided to just wait down there for her. I'm on my phone when I hear the door open. I expected it to be her. As I'm about to say, that was quick. I spin around, and I'm face to face with that guy from earlier. He just grabs my face and kisses me. I pushed at his chest and said, "What the fuck, dude? Did you not hear what I said?" He proceeded to say something in Spanish, which I can't speak, but I could pick up a few words he was saying, like puta. I had a friend who was an exchange student, and she taught me all the naughty words. I told him to fuck off, and went to push past him to go back outside. He proceeded to push me up against the wall outside and try to kiss on my neck. That's when I pushed him away as hard as I could. But he then let go of my wrists and grabbed my throat, hard, while maintaining eye contact and smirking the whole time. Just when he used his other hand and tried to grab my ass, my friend came back from getting her cigarettes, poked her head out, and saw what was happening. She tried to intervene, but he pushed her away with his other hand. I heard her say, "What the fuck? Hell no." She grabbed the closest guy to the door from inside and brought him out. The random heroic guy from inside then grabbed the crazy throat grabber, putting him in some type of chokehold, and started screaming at him. He got kicked out. I'm pretty sure someone punched him right in the face, too. Everyone was super apologetic, and said they didn't even know that guy and weren't sure who he even was or how he got there. I wasn't about to call the cops or anything, because I didn't want the party to get busted, but I went to the bathroom and immediately broke down crying. I called my friends. My friends here weren't sober enough to drive, and they came to get me. I have a couple of finger bruises on my neck still, and I hate to think of what would have happened if my friend had been distracted by something and not came inside when she did. At least I know my intuition works great. But let me just say, I'm never going to a party where I barely know anyone anymore. That was scary as hell. Apologies in advance. English is not my first language. These events took place in spring of 2014. My friends Sarah and Trisha had finally agreed to come camping with me. The problem is that none of us were experienced in surviving the wilderness, but that didn't stop us. We packed up our gear, loaded up on food, alcohol, and made our way to our location. When we arrived at the spot Sarah had Googled, we realized that we would have to hike for a while in order to find a spot suitable to set up camp. We ended up hiking for quite some time before reaching a clearing. We set up camp and started a fire, and opened up a bottle of tequila. After some drinking and a few blunts passed between us, I decided it was time to start preparing dinner, so I left Sarah and Trisha by the fire as I was separating our dinner. As I was busy preparing food, I realized that a man had started approaching our camp. "Hiya there," he said with a thick Irish accent. I was caught off guard, as I wasn't really expecting to see anyone, but nonetheless he did seem friendly, so I replied, "Oh, hi. I didn't even notice you. Have you been hiking for a while?" "Yeah, for a bit. What you cooking there?" he said, gesturing to me. I invited him to join us because I'm not rude, and like I said, he seemed like a genuinely nice guy. We walk over to the fire where I introduce him to Sarah and Trisha, who seem extremely unimpressed about our new guest. After eating dinner, we kept drinking, but during this time it was becoming very clear that our guest had really taken a liking to me. He kept trying to move closer to me, and was paying little to no attention to my friends. He was only speaking and focusing on me while drinking his bottle of whiskey. That's when things took a turn, and his conversation started to become more sexual. This made everyone uncomfortable, but it wasn't until he leaned over, grabbed the back of my neck and said, "Come on, baby, let's get rid of these two fucking bitches and come to bed with me." Before I could even react, Trisha was already right behind him, trying her best to get him away from me while screaming like a banshee. I can't remember what she was saying, but she was inventing her own swear words amongst threats and insults. It worked, and he let go of my neck. He took a step back and looked at Trisha, and let out the most sinister smile I've ever seen. It was something I can't describe, except for that with his beautiful teeth and smile, something about it combined with the look in his eyes gave me goosebumps even just typing this out. He started slowly walking away from our camp while laughing. I was absolutely petrified, but decided to quickly tidy up before hiding in my tent. I was originally meant to sleep in my own tent, while the two other girls shared, but after what had just happened, we all decided to huddle in mine together. Everything had been quiet for a while, with the exception of Trisha's snoring. I was about to fall asleep when I heard twigs crunching and the sound of footsteps fast approaching us. I laid still, holding my breath, completely immobilized by fear, until I heard my tent being opened, and Sarah letting out a scream so loud that it even jolted the Irish psycho back a few steps. Trisha had been awoken by this stage, and we were all standing outside the tent, them two yelling, and I'm fumbling with my phone trying to call for the police, when he smacked Trisha right in the face. I dropped everything and yelled, "Run! Leave everything and run now!" I held Trisha's arm and didn't look back. It's important to note that we only had socks on, running through the woods at night, with a psycho possibly chasing us. I ran until I finally tripped over a log and smashed my chin on the ground pretty hard, and that's where the three of us stayed hidden, low to the ground for a few hours, but it was completely pitch black. When we felt safe enough, we walked back to the camp, only to find everything destroyed. Both Sarah and Trisha had their weed and alcohol stolen, but my whole backpack was gone, and my phone was smashed to pieces. I thank my lucky stars that I had no documents in there that could identify me, but he definitely knew which one belonged to me and took it with him. We didn't want to waste any more time, and ran back to the car as fast as possible, occasionally injuring ourselves on the way, as we could barely see anything. We get to the car, and I'm trying to start the engine, which is doing that sound it makes when it's about to completely die, when we see him come out of the bushes and start heading towards our car laughing. We're all hysterically screaming when I hear him say that he's done something to my car so that I won't be able to start it. In my frenzy, I don't know what I did, but I managed to start the engine and floor the accelerator so hard my car did a mini jump and took off down the road, leaving him behind in the dust. I drove like an absolute maniac until we reached the next town, only to discover that my car had been leaking oil the whole way back, besides whatever other damage had been done by that psycho. We were eventually picked up by Trisha's dad, who took us to the police station to file a report, and then to the hospital to get her jaw x-rayed. It was broken in 2 different places. They never caught him. Over the years I've been on Reddit, I've shared a handful of stories to this sub. This is one that I've been saving for whatever reason, and I think I'm finally ready to share. This is probably my last Let's Not Meet, since it's not very often that something happens that's worthy of it, which is definitely not a bad thing. I've shared my other few experiences, and I think I've saved the best for last. It's a long read, but I believe it's worth it. I grew up in the South. Tons and tons of beautiful places to see that haven't been taken over by concrete yet. It's nice. But along with that, it's also pretty boring. Being a teenager and wanting to go out and have fun, it led mostly to improvising with your buddies and hoping something good will come out of the night. There wasn't really a local spot to go hang out, like a club or a cool bar, and the places that were close to this were boring because you did them so many times. I'm sure if you've ever lived in a rural area, you can understand that feeling completely. Something that I found a ton of enjoyment in as a teen was just cruising around, super late at night and listening to music. I would fill my gas tank up, grab something to drink on, a cigarillo, and would just take off driving around until the sun came up. It was a nice way for me to just clear my mind and relax. Those country back roads were always fun to drive down at 2 a.m., and it was just the right amount of spooky. Well, one night, I absolutely got more than I was bargaining for. I can't remember what month it was exactly, but I know for a fact it was in the summertime, because I was out of school, and I remember it being a comfortably chilly night. So if I was to guess it, it had been around July or August sometime. I was cruising around like I always did, and was completely worry-free. I had the music blaring, and I was in my zone. I decided to head down to a park just out of boredom. This particular park is at the very end of a long stretch of desolate country road, but it's a really pretty drive because of that. When I say desolate country road, I don't mean that it's some dirt road that goes through the woods or anything crazy like that. It's a normal paved road, but there's really nothing on it after a certain point. The entire road takes about 20 minutes to drive down to get to the park, and after about 10 minutes into the drive, the houses start to spread out further and further, to becoming no houses and just a road leading there. I think a lot of the reason I like this drive at night is because of how creepy it was. I looked at it as some sort of adventure. The park isn't open for camping or anything. It's mostly just a lot of land with walking trails and biking trails, set up through miles of woods. So obviously at around 3 a.m. in the morning, it's completely dead. I made it there and did a slow, normal little loop-around drive of the park. The night before, it had stormed very badly. So badly, I remember my parents and I had to take shelter because of the threat of a tornado touchdown. There ended up being no tornado, but the storms were pretty damn rough. Because of this, I came upon a fallen tree in the road that looped around to the exit of the park. That must have happened because of the storm. It wasn't massive or anything, but I knew for a fact there was no way I could have gotten the car over it. It was pitch black everywhere besides the front of my car, because of my headlights,
and because of that, I immediately ruled out backing up the entire way I just drove. I knew that was super dangerous, and there was just no way. At this spot on the road, there was flat land on each side of me. I figured it would make most sense to just back up in the grass beside me just a little, and then drive back the way I came. It was a one-way loop around the park, but I wasn't really worried about going out the wrong way since it was so late. I started to back up off the road so I could get my car turned around. All was good until I went to pull back up onto the road. I didn't take into account how wet the grass was, and the amount of mud. My car went absolutely nowhere. My back tires were completely stuck and were spinning in place as I was trying to floor the gas pedal. I started to become pretty scared at this point. Not the most ideal situation to be in. I immediately take my cell phone out of my pocket and saw that I had service. A super huge feeling of relief. I called my parents and told them what had happened and where I was. They were pretty pissed at me, but said they would pay for a tow truck to come and get me out. My parents both drove small four-door sedans, and they would have been zero help in the situation. I was about 45 minutes away from my house and the rest of human civilization. I realized I would be stuck out there for at least an hour before someone was able to come get me. It was a freaky feeling, but I tried to get out of my head and just continue listening to music and be on my phone in the car while I waited. Not really much more I could do. After I had calmed down some from the initial anger I had, I started to check out my surroundings. I didn't even notice at first because of everything going on, but in front of my car's placement was a field that was full of the most amount of deer I think I've ever seen at once. There legitimately must have been at least 40 in this field just walking around and eating grass. The field wasn't directly in front of my car, but if I was to get out and throw a rock in that direction, I would have easily been able to hit one of them. So if I was to guess, they were about 30 yards out. This really didn't help with the whole creepy level going on. Looking out in front of your car and seeing 80 eye reflections staring back at you was a bit of an alarming feeling, but I was relieved it was just a field of deer. I watched them for a little bit, but I was quickly over it, and started to just browse through my social media apps while waiting. They seemed to have been over it quicker than I, because they all went back to walking around and eating, once they figured out I wasn't going to attack them or anything. After browsing my phone for about 15 minutes, I finally get a call back from my parents letting me know that a tow truck guy is on the way, and about an hour and a half from my location. Still to this day, I remember hearing that and having the thought of, "You've got to be kidding me." I understood that me and only me was the reason I was in the situation I was in, so I couldn't really be mad at anyone else, but that was very obviously not what I wanted to hear. I decided that the smartest thing for me to do was just make sure all my doors were locked, lay back in my seat, and take a nap to pass the time. So that's what I did. Here we go. I wake up 45 minutes later to the feeling of being watched. I'm not sure if anyone has ever experienced that feeling before because I don't know how common it is, but there was a sixth sense alarm going off in my head, telling me that I needed to wake up right away. Waking up to that feeling in the situation I was in, and the surroundings I was in, was probably my worst case scenario. I sit up and immediately check my surroundings, only to see nothing. I looked through my car very quickly for any sort of weapon and found a pocket knife. I was very scared. Even though I saw and heard nothing, the feeling was terrifying. I was shocked to see that the field of deer in front of me was still full of them. I don't know anything about the animal, but I guess I just assumed they wouldn't hang out for long. Not sure why I thought that, but I was surprised to see them nonetheless. I called my parents back to see if they heard any kind of update from the tow truck dude. I decided not to mention the feeling I was having because I didn't want them to worry more, and I also knew that it was literally nothing more than a feeling I had, and I had nothing to back up why I was feeling that way. No update from the tow truck guy, so we assumed everything was still the same on his end. And the call lasted just a few minutes because I felt like such a dick. They both had to wake up for work in a few hours, only to have to spend a random $100, and on top of that, they were worried about me. I could tell they were annoyed by the situation, but still worried. I told them I'd make sure to tell them when the man arrived and that I was sorry. We hung up and I looked up from the phone and immediately went from 0 to 100 in panic mode. The deer in front of me were all completely perked up, staring at the same direction right in front of them. Let me remind you that there are around 40 deer in this field. Every one of them stopped dead in their tracks, standing completely still and looking at something. I put my high beams on and stared, waiting for absolutely anything to happen at all. Nothing. I tapped my horn real quick. They didn't even budge or look my way. They were still completely glued to whatever was by them. The way the tree line was, I couldn't see that far over in the field. I knew they were looking into the woods near them, but where I was at, I was only able to see them. I could hear my heartbeat. I grabbed that stupid pocket knife and waited for something to happen. I would say it was about a minute after I honked. Every single one of them started to run in unison in the opposite direction. They were running at full speed, and within 20 seconds the field was completely empty. I was petrified in fear. I knew that staying in my car is what would be the safest thing to do, but it's the worst feeling in the world when you feel like a sitting duck. My head was on a swivel. I was freaking out in every way possible. I assumed that it was a bear or something, but it could have been absolutely anything. At this point, I would have been convinced that it was the devil himself. I didn't know what to do. I knew that the tow truck was close by, but I had no idea exactly where he was. I began to shake because of nerves, and just looked around to make sure nothing was by me, focusing on the field in front of me. I did this for what felt like an actual eternity, sitting in complete silence and darkness in the middle of nowhere. 15 of the longest minutes of my life go by, when I start to see lights breaking through the tree line on the road. As it gets closer, I see that it's the tow truck guy. The lights on his truck felt like it was Jesus coming from heaven to rescue me. He gets up to me and I jump out of my car and immediately ask if he has a gun on him. I told him very quickly what had just happened, and that something was definitely out there in the woods nearby. He let me know that he had a shotgun in the truck, and assured me that it was most likely a deer or a bobcat. He even gave me the whole "they're more scared of you than you are of them" speech. The tree was small enough for him to sort of bulldoze it out of the way with his truck, and then he attached my car to his and pulled me out of the spot I was stuck in. He was pretty nonchalant about what I had just experienced, but I was pretty shaken up from it. The whole time he was doing his thing, I still had my eyes glued out in that field waiting for something. He was completely done with everything in about 15 minutes, and he told me to follow his truck out of there onto the main road again. I got in my car and was ready more than anything to get the hell out of this park. We started to drive away from the spot I was in, and I still had my head on a swivel. As we were driving away, I decided to look into my rear view mirror. We were down the park road just a tiny bit, but I could still see the spot I was stuck in, partially lit up from the vehicle's lights and the moon. I watched in my rear view mirror as a man came out of the tree line behind where my car was and walked into the middle of the road, watching us drive away. My heart stopped beating. Legitimately. I lost my breath and my eyes started to get full of tears because of how absolutely scared I was in this moment. I couldn't see any sort of details of what he looked like, or even what he was wearing. The feeling that I felt of driving away from that spot, knowing he was right there the whole time watching me as I was freaking out looking around, as I was completely alone for a long time. Maybe he even came right up to my window and watched me as I slept. That's a feeling that's something I can't necessarily put into words. Even after all these years, it still messes with me. The entire time we were driving off, as long as I could see him, he didn't move at all. Just watched us on the road. A million things went through my mind. I was scared there may have been multiple people up the road waiting for us. I was trying to figure out if I should start beating on my horn like crazy to get the tow truck guy to stop or not. I decided that all I wanted to do was get out of there, more than anything. The second that we finally got out of the park and were able to be on a 2-lane road again, I flew past the tow truck driver and did nothing below 70 the entire way home. I flew through stop signs and stoplights. I absolutely did not care. The only thing on my mind was making it home. I got home, ran inside, and very quickly acknowledged my parents, said sorry and thank you, and went to my room. I didn't get a single second of sleep for the rest of my night. I was searching for any records of things happening in that area. I came to the conclusion that the man must have been some sort of squatter or homeless. I read many things online about how it's common for homeless in rural areas to build shelters in the woods, which does make sense to me entirely on why they would do that. But obviously, the unknown is the scariest part of all. What if he wasn't homeless? What if he was going to hurt me? What if? There's so many possibilities of what could have happened, but the outcome that did is what I'm most grateful for. I never told my parents about this story until many years later, after it happened. I was already an adult and had moved out. It freaked them out too when I told them. I never went back to that park ever. Even though I no longer live by there, I still have no desire at all to ever go back. I don't think I could even with broad daylight with a ton of people around. I also made the decision to stop doing those late-night cruises. I did a few after that time with people, but even then I felt very uncomfortable and always on edge. So this little nugget of a memory still creeps me out to this day. When I was a kid, my mom and I lived in a somewhat sucky neighborhood in Chicago. Despite the condition of the neighborhood, the apartment complex we lived in was fantastic. Our top floor unit had a fireplace that saved our lives in the winter. For those that don't live in or haven't even visited Chicago, the Windy City is particularly icy in colder seasons, and a nice quality considering the area. AC that iced out the front area of the unit in the summer, but the back area, where the bedrooms were, remained hotter than Satan's armpits. Because of the temperature on hot, or cold in this case, days, my mom and I would camp out in the living room to sleep on those nights. Anyway, despite the rough neighborhood, I remember having a pretty good childhood in the short time we were there. Maybe because my mom always made sure to protect me from the parts of the neighborhood that were exceptionally rough. So, on one winter night, our apartment was freezing cold. My mom told me to grab my pillows and a blanket because we were going to have a sleepover in the living room. She popped some popcorn, made hot chocolate, one with no marshmallows for me, and one loaded with them for her. We ate and drank and watched Christmas movies before I passed out, clearly white girl wasted on hot chocolate. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up to go to the bathroom and saw a movement in the kitchen. I don't know if it was because I was stupid tired or oblivious to what was going on, but I called out, "Mommy?" even though she was asleep on the couch next to me. The person, who I soon realized was a man because of his huge stature and lack of hair under the mask he wore, walked over and crouched down to eye level in front of me and whispered, "Shh." I simply shrugged, went to the bathroom, and came back to the living room to go to sleep. And that was that. The man was no longer there, and the door was left slightly ajar. I chalked it up to one of those lucid dreams and filed it away in my repressed memories. I do remember, however, moving the next day into my grandparents' place for about a month until we found something else, but because I was so young, my mom never told me why. Not until I was grown, at least. The topic of the apartment randomly came up in conversation, and I offhandedly told her about the dream I remembered having. This is the terrifying conversation that ensued. Did I ever tell you about that weird dream I had? No, I don't think so. What dream? After I told her, she went as pale as a ghost. Now my mother is a dark-skinned black woman, so seeing her go pale scared the hell out of me. That wasn't a dream. That really happened. Now it was my turn to go pale. I felt my stomach fall to my ass and stared at her for her to continue on. I woke up in the middle of the night, and this man was standing above me staring. I remember immediately demanding, "Where is my child?" I tried to get up, but he growled, and then whispered angrily, "Don't move." At this, I started tearing up. I saw the fear in her eyes, the utter terror of thinking something had happened to her only child. I hated seeing my mom so upset. It's been just us practically all of my life, so to imagine her having to move herself and a young girl out of a neighborhood from sheer terror, it's hard to say the least. The man just continued to stare at me. He rushed out of the apartment when he heard you flush the toilet, and left everything he was going to steal. The next morning I packed up our stuff, and we went to live with Nana and Papa. I left all the furniture, plates, glassware. Just got our clothes and got the hell out of Dodge. But because we vacated the lease, it kind of screwed up my credit. But I couldn't imagine sleeping in that place another night. We sat there in silence together, freaking out because of my dream, which had actually happened to not be a dream. It was all too real. I'd say it was simply a drug addict trying to make off with some stuff. But why walk up to a child and tell her to be quiet, instead of just leaving with what you'd already packed away? Why stare at a woman, make her lie still in place, only to leave when the kid comes out of the bathroom? Just why? "2002. I was 14 years old and starting freshman year. I was an awkward, nerdy girl that didn't know how to handle attention from boys, so you could say I made things worse for my situation. I had a knack for making friends with the weird people that no one liked, but I tried to be friendly with everyone I met, so it wasn't a big deal for me. Clubs were a big deal, and they actually had an anime club, so of course I was all about that. At the first club meeting, I sat next to a couple of friends and just soaked it all up. I thought I was finally with my people. Then here comes Stalker Kid. I'd use his real name, but to this day I have no idea what it is. He sat in front of me, and being that person, I said hi. I could tell he was a bit uncomfortable and didn't know anyone at the event, so I was just being nice. And boy, did this guy cling to me for that one word. At first, he would just find me during lunch and just stand there mumbling things to me. He had such a soft, high-pitched voice, a mousy little guy that you just felt unnerved when he spoke to you. The way he would look at you as he spoke, I could never look him in the eyes. After a while, it became more asking about my personal life and what I was into. Me being dumb and naive, I tried to be friendly and chat while feeling a bit uncomfortable. After a while, my friends and I would move to different tables, benches, even hallways to avoid him, but he always somehow found me. After about a year of this, my best friend finally told me that if I didn't tell him to fuck off, he would. I really didn't want him around anymore, so sure, go ahead. So one day during lunch, here comes the Stalker Kid with his signature greeting, barely above a whisper. My buddy just tells him, "Dude, she's not interested, go away." Looking hurt, he shuffles away. I thought he didn't have to be so hard at him, but I thanked him anyways. I didn't see him much around school after that, except for club days where he would just sit across the room and stare at me, while my best friend glared at him. Cut to me being 16 and driving now, minus the awkward club days. I didn't really notice anything from him. That is, until an old gray beat-up car started parking next to me extremely close. One day after school, he was waiting for me in that car. He started asking me how I'd been, what about prom and all that stuff. I was trying to rack my brain on how he knew that was my car, unless he had been watching me before and after school. I started getting there later and leaving later to avoid him, because he was like clockwork. Finally, a boy I used to be friends with in elementary school was walking out with me, and made a comment about how that guy was always next to my car, and asked if he was my boyfriend. I immediately said no, and he's always following me around and that I hated it. It was really starting to freak me out. Bless this guy, because he walked right up to him and scared him off, threatening that if he ever parked near me again that he would kick his ass. I figured maybe that would be enough to keep him away. So again, there was a small space where I would hear nothing of him, except for my friends who had classes with him, telling me about how creepy he was. One friend had art class with him, and said he would draw nothing but naked women constantly in his books. What a classy guy. Junior year was wrapping up, and I started taking my BFF, Phil we'll call him, to and from school. He was on my way, so I figured why not. At some point, Phil started noticing that a little gray car was always heading the same way after school, and made a joke thinking, what if a stalker kid lived next to him? What a small world, right? I could only be so lucky. One day, as per usual, the little gray car was following us, so we took a detour. Sure enough, he was with us every step of the way. It was no longer a joke. We both started freaking out. I pushed the gas pedal as hard as my foot could push it, and noped out of sight. I went home and told my mom everything, because at this point I knew this wasn't normal. She shoved it aside, saying I was probably seeing things. Well, it came time for our end-of-the-year club party. Of course, SK was a senior, so I would never have to see him again. For whatever stupid reason, I offered to host the party thinking he hasn't gone to one yet, so let's celebrate this moment. I was terrified when my dad let him in the door. I don't remember ever giving him an invitation to the party. He spent the whole party talking to me and my dad, being all buddy-buddy with him, asking stuff about me and where my room was. I just wanted to cry and hide. It was all downhill after that. I remember there were days when I would hear a car pull up outside my front door, and my room having a window that saw the front. I would call my buddy Phil and peek to see if it was him. 3 times in 1 month. I just hid under my desk and cried on the phone with Phil. Other events from school would be him asking a girl I played softball with to prom, only to dump her and follow me around all night. This includes to after the prom, where I never saw him in person. Our high school had a radio/TV channel for kids to run, and during prom they would record us going up the stairs and playing around in the gym and after prom for the parents to see their kids having fun. Took one of my friends to point it out, but it showed me playing DDR for a while against my friend Phil, and SK was standing right behind me, watching me for a good 5 minutes. I never even knew. The one that still creeps me out to this day is graduation for his class. Our classes were so big. They did a day and night ceremony where all the students had to attend the day one. I was scanning the crowd to see my friends who were graduating when I saw a hand wave as I passed by. I looked back, and of course it was SK waving at me. How he had picked me out from a crowd of thousands I'll never know. 2006. Senior year was great. No signs of the creepy SK to the point where I started to forget about him. I graduated and chose a college in town. I got a job at a local retail store and started to move on. Life was beginning to be normal. I work in the gaming department, so you get some weird randos every once in a while. One that I saw a lot was this little Mexican guy with glasses who never purchased anything but would just walk around from time to time. Then, SK comes strolling in the doors and walks into gaming and just talks. I ask how he knew I worked here. He said his friend saw me and knew we were friends. I tried to radio for help over and over for someone to come and get him out. Finally, a big guy from computers walks by and asks for my help in the back. Once he pulls me to safety, I tell him everything. From that point, security was aware and is told to watch out for this guy. Of course, he wasn't doing anything physical, so all they could do for me is to watch out for him. so every time he came in they would walkie me, and I would dip back to the warehouse. I started seeing his friend, who we called Ninja Friend, constantly, and all he ever did was walk around on his phone. I began to suspect he was texting SK to tell him where I was, because sure enough, 10 minutes later he would come in too. So I tested this theory, and started to randomly walk around the store. At one point, a friend who worked the register asked why I would do this, so I had her take a walk with me on her break. I told her this NF would follow us everywhere, even just going down a random aisle. Sure enough, he did, and she began freaking out. A few minutes later, I told her my stalker would walk through the doors. Sure enough. I'm making my way to the warehouse, and out steps Ninja Friend from an aisle and says, "She's right here." I just stared at him, like, who the hell do you think you are? SK walks up behind me and asks why I'm always running away from him. Oh, and he nosed my number and asks if I can give it to him again. I say, knowing damn good and well I never even gave it to him in the first place, sure. I go to the warehouse and write, "This is where I work. Don't ever come here again," and hand it to him. Glare at his friend, walkie security about him, and sit in the warehouse and break down. Security later tells me that he also cried when they took him out. And later that day, as I'm leaving work, security offers to walk me to my car. This, of course, isn't the rules, but friends caring about friends, so I say sure. SK is out by my car waiting for me, so this is where security says fuck it and calls the police, which we are conveniently next to their headquarters. He books it when he sees the car. A few years go by and nothing comes up. I buy a fancy new car and don't see him around that much. I'm thinking that did the trick and I'm finally free. My buddies and I are leaving work, ready to hit a night at the bar as per usual Thursday deal. We're all walking out the door, where we all have to stand and wait to hear the alarm sound to verify it's armed. As we're walking out, I hear it. That awful sound. Hey! I cringe and grab my friend's arm and turn. There he is, leaning on his car, waiting. My friend recognizes him and asks him what he wants. He says he just wants to talk to me. He didn't ever see my car, so he didn't think I worked here anymore. His other friend is sitting in the back seat of his car just staring at me blankly. I started to think the worst. If my friends leave me here, my gut tells me I'm not coming into work the next day, or ever. I'm terrified that he's had years of time to think about our last encounter, where I wrote my number down and made him cry. I grab my friend's arm tighter. My friend goes off, pretends to be my boyfriend, and rips into him. My friend is about 2 feet taller than him, and much, much bigger. They get into it, and I'm just standing in the parking lot. I'm a terrible person for this, but I'm sure you understand at this point. Thinking, kick his ass. He spooked SK so bad that I'm pretty sure he pissed himself before getting back in his car and booking it. Ever since, if he comes into the store, my friend stares him down from his office, and he leaves. He's never bought anything in all these years. Years later, I've moved on and gotten married, and moved out of town. Recently, we moved back to start a business, and to this day I still feel myself looking behind me at stores, just in case I randomly bump into him. He caused me to have anxiety, mental and emotional pain, fear and trust issues for a decade. Even after moving on, I still feel the effects today, and I never even knew his name. When I was 7, I lived in a dusty, vacant part of the West, with an atmosphere straight out of a Judy Blume novel. Despite everyone in my neighborhood living on large, isolated plots of land, mostly being ranching families, kids played hockey in the streets, crime was minimal to non-existent, and everybody knew everybody else. I had a tight-knit group of friends, names changed to protect privacy. Let's call them Shirley, Natalie, and Bailey. We'd been friends since before we could walk, mostly because we were the same age and all lived in the same neighborhood. We weren't idiots, but we were definitely sheltered. The same could be said of our parents, many of whom ended their education after high school, or even a bit sooner, and grew up in similar, if not the exact same community, where anyone who'd shake your hand was probably trustworthy. That's why no one noticed anything before it was too late. Just before the summer had started, a new family moved in. Families moving in wasn't terribly uncommon, but this family had a girl my friend's age, so it became a big deal. Her name was Ella, and her whole family was a bit strange. It took 2 weeks for them to introduce themselves to anyone. Plenty of people went over to introduce themselves, but even when it was obvious people were home, nobody ever came to the door. Finally, word got around that the father was a minister at some church that no one in town had heard of, and his wife was working part-time at the tailor. We spent a lot of time outside, and eventually spotted Ella. My friends and I invited her to join our group in whatever we were up to that afternoon. Through that, we learned she had 4 older brothers and an infant sister. She and her whole family had very antiquated gender roles, prayed before and about virtually anything they did, and would casually mention the end of the world as a non sequitur. Despite this, they managed to somehow establish themselves as pillars of the community. The father, let's call him Mr. Cyrus, came to every town hall, and his wife, Mrs. Cyrus, took up leadership role in the PTA. I think their wholesome Christian image helped defray what would have otherwise been deeply troubling outbursts of rage, which Mr. Cyrus would exhibit, sometimes right out in public. He'd hear another adult use a phrase like "God damn it," and fly into a frenzy about how dare they forsake our Lord and Savior, taking his name in vain. His wife would make unsolicited judgmental comments about how other people raise their kids, especially daughters. Despite all that, within a few months you'd never know they hadn't lived there all their lives. The unspoken understanding in this town was if you left your kids in someone else's care, they had free rein to do whatever they thought best for them, and feed them, instruct them, or discipline them, same as if you were their own. The first time I went to Ella's, nothing out of the ordinary happened. The second time, Mr. Cyrus led all of us in prayer before we ate our snack, and afterward. I mentioned to my mom how I found it infuriating, and she basically said, "Their house, their rules." I shrugged it off. Neither of us had any way to know Mr. Cyrus was testing the waters. A few weeks later, several of our families had gotten together, and Mr. Cyrus brought a rifle out of nowhere and asked us girls if we wanted to shoot some cans. He said to the parents once he'd gotten us excited, "I mean, if you're comfortable with guns." Remember, this is rural America. Not one of us girls hadn't already fired a gun in our lives, and if any of the parents were uncomfortable about guns, they would never admit so in public. Things progressed little by little every time I went over. Within the next few visits, my friends and I were made to participate in a mini Bible study session. I guess one of the other girls had told their parents about the praying, because when we were dropped off, Mr. Cyrus said, "Oh, I forgot to mention, Eileen and I had a family Bible study planned for tonight. If you're uncomfortable with that, you can bring the girls back another night." This was the West in the 80s. Christianity was the default, and even people who didn't really practice felt obligated to pretend they did. No one in this town would have objected to their kids participating in a Bible study loud enough for anyone to hear. It didn't even matter, because it was sort of fun. None of us complained about it, and we all seen how Ella seemed into it, and wouldn't have wanted to hurt her feelings by complaining. I think Mr. Cyrus took that as one of the final go-aheads needed. In late August, Miss Cyrus called my friend's parents and asked if we wanted to have a sleepover with Ella. Everyone agreed. The first red flag flew up right away. Most of us girls spent half our days off from school doing farm chores and helping around the house, so we were all in jeans. I had never seen Ella in pants ever, but what we wore had never been any sort of problem. When we got there this time, though, Ella had laid out 4 of her dresses on the bed and told us to change into them to look more like girls. We all liked playing dress-up, so changed without complaint, but when we went downstairs, Mr. Cyrus said, "Look how ladylike you all are now," Doesn't that feel better? You've made God very happy. At this point in a playdate, we'd usually go out back and make mud pies or play tag or something, but instead Mr. Cyrus jumped right into a Bible lesson. He was basically giving a sermon and talked about heaven and hell and the ways to get into heaven and the ways to go to hell. He scared our 7-year-old minds half to death about the fires of hell. Then he did what I can only describe as a cartoony attempt at hypnosis. This was years ago, so it's a little fuzzy, but he dangled some piece of jewelry like a necklace or something in front of us and swung it back and forth. While he did that, he recited Bible verses about telling the truth and repentance and the end times, clean souls entering the glory of heaven. Then he sat us all down on a couch. We were all roughly freaked out at this point because of the heaven-hell talk. We figured everything was just a religious ritual of their home, because he'd so carefully desensitized us over the past few months. He talked about sin and repentance, and asked us if we wanted to go to heaven or hell. I think you can guess what we all said. He said the only way to get into heaven was to be baptized. One of my friends, Shirley, said she'd already been baptized, but Mr. Cyrus cut them off. Baptized into the real faith, God's faith. He asked if we wanted to know how we could become baptized, and we all said yes. He said by confessing our sins and making them right with God, committing to living in a Christian-like way, and most importantly, accepting Jesus as our Lord and Savior. Sounded easy enough to us. For the next I don't know how long, there were no clocks in the house and it was after dark by then. We basically did an intense Bible study. It could have been anywhere between 10 minutes and 4 hours. When you're little and not accustomed to going to church, any amount of Bible study feels like an eternity. This was interspersed with different prayers for our salvation and making promises about rejecting sin and resisting temptation. We were all getting very tired and feeling our patience wearing thin for tolerating others' religious beliefs. Then there was a whole bunch of prepper stuff. Different types of guns, talking about growing your own food, the importance of self-reliance. Basically a lecture on survival skills, but with constant emphasis that the greatest survival skill is being a good Christian. He kept us up most of the night after that praying and such. He did some ritual stuff with rubbing oil on our foreheads. He vaguely talked on and off throughout the night about whether we'd want to go with Ella to a wonderful place with lots of other kids who love Christ. He said he'd ask our parents about taking us there on a weekend trip. I knew when I was agreeing with him that I had no interest, but my mom had taught me the polite thing to do when you get an invitation to something you have no intention of going to is to smile and express interest. Then closer to the date, say something came up. So I just smiled and expressed interest. He didn't feed us anything the entire time we were there. By the time it started to get light out, we were baptized in the backyard. Then we finally fell asleep, and a few hours later we were picked up. I told my mom I didn't want to go back because it was too religious for me. I told her we were up a lot of the night praying. I told my mom there was no food also, but since I was such a picky eater, she was too used to hearing they had nothing to eat, when really it was something like they served a meatloaf and wouldn't even make me a grilled cheese. We stopped playing with Ella and just kind of put it behind us until high school, mentioning once every few years about that weirdly religious play date. Since we didn't really understand any of the promises we had made to Mr. Cyrus, we didn't pay half a mind to keeping any of them. We were exhausted and surrounded in daily life by Jesus rhetoric that everyone took seriously in the moment and then ignored once the preacher was out of earshot. In high school, it was heavily rumored that Ella's father, Mr. Cyrus, had Florence Hutef, famed for her involvement with the controversial Branch Davidians, visiting his home and leading some sort of prayer circle for him and the people of his church. While I still don't know if she really came to visit him, it was confirmed irrefutably in high school that Mr. Cyrus belonged to an offshoot of Shepherd's Rod, the Christian apocalyptic extremist group rooted in the Seventh-day Adventism. Nobody really talked to them much after that, in town even, because we all considered it a cult. I went out of state after high school, and I have no idea what happened with Ella's family after that. This happened just an hour ago. I'm a 21-year-old female in a small college town. It's in the country and usually very safe. I've never felt uneasy before this. Here's my story. Sorry, it's probably sort of long and all jumbled because I'm still so worked up. I'm still shaking a bit, but I thought you guys would like this story and maybe learn a bit from me. Never to walk alone. I don't care how safe you think you'll be. My friend, who lives a street over from me, asked me to check in on her cat every day while she's gone for the weekend. At around 7, I walked over to her apartment. It was still light out at this time, and this walk is extremely easy on public streets of student housing. It doesn't take any more than 5 minutes. I didn't plan to stay very long, just to check the food and water and give some loving and come right back. But I got carried away, because I love this cat, and didn't leave until around 8:15ish. By this time it was dark already, and her street is very poorly lit. I had never noticed before. So I'm walking down the street, when I hear whistling behind me. Not a whistle tune, but just whistles like they were whistling to a dog. I ignore it because I honestly thought it was just a group of students going out to party or something. I hear a loud, "Hey!" followed by more whistles. I look back and there's a man walking on the same side as me, but very far back, about 100 yards away from me. I check my pocket because I think maybe I may have dropped something. My keys or phone, and maybe he's trying to give them back? I check my pocket. Nope. I have all my things. I frequent this sub a lot and love crime shows, so red flags started to go off, but I honestly thought I was being a bit dramatic. I decided to just continue walking. I'm about halfway down the hill when I look back and see that he's much closer now, speed walking down this hill in my direction. Now I started panicking. I call my friend on FaceTime and start speed walking while telling her what's happening. I round the corner to go toward my house and look back. This guy is walking so fast he almost starts sprinting, and we're now only about 30 yards away. I can't explain how far away he started and how close he suddenly seemed to me. I was terrified. I started sprinting. He had to have sprinted down that hill after me. At this point, I didn't know what to do. He was so close and it was dark. No one was on the street, and I couldn't outrun him to my house. I turned to face him, still about 30 yards away, when I see it's a tall man. This next part gives me chills. I scream at him, "What do you want from me?" And he doesn't answer. He completely ignores my screaming and keeps running straight towards me. I was crying at this point and desperate. I start knocking on a random person's door, praying to God that someone would answer. I'm knocking on this kid's door, and in between us is a car. Basically, the creepy guy has suddenly started walking very slowly behind me and the car that separates us as I'm knocking on this random door. The creepy man is standing right behind the car I'm in front of. By the grace of God, a kid opens his door, and I quickly ask to come in, explaining that a man is following me and that I'm terrified. As the kid starts to let me in, the creepy man sprints in the other direction. I completely lost it. I was crying and shaking on this kid's couch. I broke my flip-flop and cut open my toe while I was running away from this guy. My friend came to pick me up, and I called the police and filed a report. I wish I did so earlier while it was happening, but I was just so scared I didn't think of it. It honestly was the scariest thing to ever happen to me, and I'm currently on bed watching The Office trying to forget about it. I can't stop shaking. Who knows what he wanted and what his plan was? Thank God someone opened the door for me, because I have a strong gut feeling I would have never made it home.
What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here as always. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you guys enjoyed the content of this video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you do decide you like my content enough to subscribe, please be sure to hit the bell button right next to the subscribe button and turn notifications to all so you can be notified of every video I post in the future. If you don't feel like doing that though, I post a video nearly every day, so you can just come back every now and then and check up on what you missed. If you guys have any criticisms on what I can do better or any feedback on the stories in the video, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as I always enjoy reading all the comments and I try to give them hearts and respond when I can. If you guys would like to reach me for any reason, or you would like to send in a story to be read, you can go ahead and take a look in the description below the video. You'll find a link to all of my social media, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has a theme, and how you would like to be credited in the description of the video the story appears in. Last but not least, I also run two other channels, Mr. Blue Skies and Darkest Hour, where I do true crime videos and dark documentaries respectively. If that kind of content sounds interesting to you, why not go ahead and check it out and see if it is for you. Aside from that though, guys, I think that's pretty much it for now, so thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.